Secret Invasion happens after the events of Civil War. In the aftermath of the conflict, Iron Man is the head of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Avengers. Captain America is dead, and the superheroes who are against registration are fugitives, working as the Secret Avengers, led by Luke Cage. Iron Man discovers that a Skrull has been impersonating Elektra. He learns that there is no way to know who the Skrulls are while they are alive, but once they're dead, they go back to their alien form. Fearing that this could be a sign of a coming invasion, he brings in Reed Richards and Hank Pym, who at this point in his career is going by Yellow Jacket, to study the alien corpse and hopefully discover a way to tell who is a Skrull and who is not. Before they can get into it, Iron Man gets word that a Skrull spacecraft is crash landing on Earth and will land in the Savage Lands. If you don't know what the Savage Lands are, it's basically a tropical island with dinosaurs that used to be Magneto's base of operations. Iron Man assembles the Avengers and sets off to investigate the crash, leaving Mr. Fantastic and Yellow Jacket to continue studying the alien. Not wanting to be left out of the loop, Luke Cage and the Secret Avengers steal a Quinjet and also go to the Savage Lands. Luke wants to tear open the ship to see what's inside, but Iron Man shows up and starts whining and trying to place Luke under arrest. Despite Carol Danvers, who at this point is going by Miss Marvel, not Captain Marvel, despite her trying to calm down Luke and Tony, the two factions of superheroes almost come to blows. Before this can happen, several Skrull sleeper agents begin their attack across the globe, taking out the Sword satellite, the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier, Thunderbolt's mountain, and sending the Baxter building into the negative zone. A Skrull, who has been posing as the Avengers' butler, Jarvis, uploads an alien virus to Tony's Iron Man suit, which disables his suit and also makes him sick. The crashed Skrull ship opens, revealing doubles of several superheroes, all claiming to be the real superheroes. Back in the lab, Mr. Fantastic thinks that he has uncovered a way to determine who is a Skrull and who is a human, but before he can reveal it, Hank Pym reveals himself to be a Skrull and shoots Richards, making him more of a wad of chewing gum than a man. And that brings us to Issue 2. Issue 2 is relatively uneventful, as it mostly comprises of the Avengers and the Secret Avengers teaming up to fight the mystery doubles who have arrived on the Skrull ship, while dealing with the paranoia of not knowing who they can trust and who is a Skrull in disguise. While this is happening, a group of Super Skrulls, Skrulls who have the powers of various superheroes, attack New York City and begin firing on civilians. Moving on to Issue 3. The S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier has gone down in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle. Maria Hill navigates her way through the bowels of the sinking airship, and when she reaches the deck, is greeted by the Skrull who has been impersonating Jarvis, who demands that she surrender. Yellow Jacket shows up at Camp Hammond, a training ground for newly registered heroes, and tells the Initiative that they need to prepare for the upcoming battle and go into New York to fight the Skrulls. In the city, the Young Avengers are locked in battle with the invading Skrulls, barely holding them off when the Initiative shows up to support the young heroes. Meanwhile, in the Savage Lands, Carol Danvers drops off Tony Stark at an abandoned lab to try and fix his suit, while she sets off for the city to try and help out there. So, Iron Man is by himself trying to deal with his suit and his illness when Spider-Woman shows up and reveals that she is actually the Empress of the Skrulls. She tells Tony that he is actually a Skrull sleeper agent who had their mind wiped, and that the events of Civil War were actually part of a plan to divide the heroes, making it easier to conquer the Earth. Tony, of course, finds this surprising and isn't sure what to believe. Is it better to be a smart invader who started a civil war to divide the heroes just in time for a massive invasion, or to be an allegedly really smart superhero who accomplishes the same thing by accident? Who's to say? Back in New York, the heroes are getting their butts kicked by the Skrull. They are being subdued, and Vision is getting his mind blown. Just when all seems lost, you know who shows up? Nick Fury rolls up with his brand new band of howling commandos, ready to kick those Skrulls to the curb. In issue 4, we learn that Mr. Fantastic is alive and is being held prisoner in space on one of the Skrull ships. Back in New York, the Howling Commandos, the Initiative, and the Young Avengers manage to beat back the invading Super Skrull. Miss Marvel, who, just to remind you, is Carol Danvers at this point and not Kamala Khan, shows up, but Fury thinks she's a Skrull and shoots her with his energy gun, leaving her to be overwhelmed by Skrull. Back in the Savage Land, the Skrull Empress continues to try and convince Iron Man that he's a Skrull. Black Widow overhears this conversation, but is interrupted by the versions of Jean Grey and Beast who emerged from the crashed ship. She manages to take them out and they are revealed to be Skrulls. The Spider-Woman Skrull escapes and Black Widow talks to Tony and tells him that her spy instincts tell her he's not a Skrull, and that the Skrull Empress was just messing with him. Wolverine shows up, and the three heroes talk about their situation and agree that they need Mr. Fantastic. Meanwhile, in space, Agent Brand, the head of S.W.O.R.D., is still alive, floating around in the cosmos. She manages to sneak on board and decides to mount a rescue mission to save Reed Richards. Back in New York, the Hood and his villainous friends watch the invasion on television. The Hood decides that they will prepare to intervene and help the heroes save Earth, as no Earth would be bad for business. Thor turns up with Captain America in tow, which is odd because we were all under the impression that he was dead. Issue 5. At Thunderbolt's Mountain. The Thunderbolts are being attacked by the Skrull who was impersonating Captain Marvel, the Kree warrior Mar-Vell, not Carol Danvers, who is Miss Marvel instead of Kamala Khan, who is no one at this point. The leader of the Thunderbolts, Norman Osborn, realizes that the Skrull can't bring himself to kill any of them. He talks to the Skrull and discovers that he was a sleeper agent who, until he was activated, truly believed himself to be the heroic Captain Marvel and is having trouble committing to the bad guy thing. Rather than continue attacking the Thunderbolts, Mar-Vell leaves. Nick Fury brings the heroes to his New York base, where they witness a broadcast where several Skrulls who have been posing as celebrities and world leaders give the people of Earth a really long-winded speech that essentially boils down to assimilate or be destroyed. Thankfully, back in space, Agent Brand has managed to rescue Mr. Fantastic on the Skrull ship. They fall under attack, but are saved by the Skrull Captain Marvel, who has decided that world domination is overrated. Brand and Richards make their way back to Earth to try and save the day. Back on the sinking SHIELD helicarrier, Agent Hill pulls a sneaky with a life model decoy and escapes the Skrull, blowing up the helicarrier in the process. Meanwhile, back in the Savage Lands, the heroes are all arguing about who is and isn't a Skrull when Brand and Reed show up in their spaceship. Reed fires a beam that reveals everyone's true form, making the heroes able to attack and defeat the secret invaders among them. By the way, Iron Man's not a Skrull. Leading us into Issue 6. Issue 6 opens with the Skrull who is posing as Mar-Vell, who goes by the superhero name Captain Marvel, because Carol Danvers is still Miss Marvel at this point in the continuity, who is not a Skrull. I'm getting lost. What was I talking about? Oh, yeah. The Skrull dies in an explosion, but not before telling Marvel Boy that he must save the Earth. We see a montage of all the heroes over the globe fighting off the Skrull. Alpha Flight doesn't get a panel, but I'm assuming it's because they were having a fight so awesome that the writers thought that including it would overshadow the rest of the comic. Back in New York City, all the heroes who were in the Savage Lands team up with all the heroes who are fighting in the city to fight the Skrull forces. They are soon joined by Thor, Captain America, the Thunderbolts, as well as the Hood and the other villains. This unlikely team bands together and they take on the Skrull army. Issue 7. As the battle rages, Spider-Man remains optimistic, saying that things can't be too bad because the Watcher has not shown up. So anyway, the Watcher shows up, and the heroes and Skrulls continue to fight. In Avengers Tower, Jessica Jones, who at this point is married to Luke Cage and has a child, Danielle Cage, watches the battle on television with Jarvis. She decides that she needs to help her fellow heroes and leaves her child with Jarvis, not knowing that he is a Skrull in disguise. Marvel Boy joins the battle, and Clint Barton, who is in his Ronin phase at this point in continuity, manages to hit the Spider-Woman Skrull Empress with an arrow. It seriously injures her, but she does not die. Just when the Skrull forces seem beaten, they reveal their secret weapon. Turns out, before the secret invasion, the Skrull, posing as Hank Pym, had given Janet Van Dyne, the Wasp, a growth formula that had been tampered with. They activate their plan, and as Wasp becomes giant, she becomes a giant chemical bomb, which is making all of the heroes deathly ill. In the final issue of the series, Thor is able to spin his hammer really fast, causing a tornado that is able to take out Janet before she causes any serious damage. This unfortunately kills her in the process. This of course leaves all the heroes really angry, and they prepare to attack the injured Skrull Empress. Before any of the heroes can make a move on her, Norman Osborn kills her with a gunshot to the head. The heroes take out the remaining Skrull ships and find a ship which contains all of the missing people the Skrulls have been impersonating. While this is happening, the Fantastic Four manage to close the Negative Zone portal, although the Baxter building has been pretty much destroyed. When the real Jarvis is found on the Skrull prisoner ship, Jessica Jones realizes her mistake and rushes back to Avengers Tower, only to realize that the Skrull Jarvis is gone and has taken her baby with him. Tony tries to chum it up with Thor after the battle, but the God of Thunder is having none of it, and tells Tony he considers him responsible for the invasion, as he had divided the heroes with the Civil War and failed to prevent the invasion despite being the leader of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Avengers. This sentiment is echoed by the President, who fires Stark and replaces him with the man who saved the Earth from the Skrull Empress, Norman Osborn. The President puts S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Avengers under the Thunderbolt's banner and gives Osborn control of the entire operation. This of course thrills Norman, who meets up with some of his supervillain pals to plot and scheme about how they are going to use their new power. Well, that is the plot of Secret Invasion. It's a fun read with plenty of crossover issues that we haven't gotten into here, but are definitely worth checking out.
Starting off with the One Below All. The One Below All is the dark side and a part of the same being known as the One Above All, who is the supreme ruler of the multiverse and the supreme embodiment of creation and compassion, which would make the One Below All the ultimate personification of destruction and hate. It resides in the lowest point of reality, called the Below Place, from which it rules. Sealed off from the rest of the multiverse through the metaphysical green doors, it manifests in other realities through extreme gamma, which is the mutagenic third form of gamma radiation. This radiation is what creates gamma mutates based off the individual's genetic and psychological makeup. Before we move on though, hey guys, if you're enjoying this channel, dropping a like is all you have to do to help us out. We would really appreciate it. But now, on to the man himself, Bruce Banner. Incredible Hulk #1 from 1962 introduced Dr. Robert Bruce Banner to the Marvel Universe and gave us the very first gamma mutate. During a routine test of the gamma bomb he developed, Bruce spotted a teenager named Rick Jones in the blast radius, and he took it upon himself to save Rick's life. He succeeded, but his bomb's explosion opened the first green door, which is a metaphysical barrier into the Below Place, and infused him with gamma radiation, turning him into the Grey Hulk. Now over time, Hulk's skin eventually turned green, thanks to some real world mix-ups, and he became more childlike. In Incredible Hulk #377, the Green and Grey Hulks merged with Bruce to become a new incarnation, Professor Hulk. But these three different incarnations of Hulk are just a few of the personalities that live in Bruce's fractured mind, and not all of them are good people. On to Bruce's family, starting with Brian Banner and Rebecca Banner. While Bruce is naturally the core figure in this family tree, the roots of the Hulk's rage come from his father, Brian Banner, and without him, there would honestly be no Hulk. If there's a villain in this story, it's Brian. He physically and emotionally mistreated his wife Rebecca Banner and their son. As seen in Incredible Hulk #312 from 1968, Brian became deeply disturbed and obsessed with the idea that his radiation research had turned his son Bruce into a monster. Brian was even responsible for the passing of Rebecca in front of Bruce, which led directly to the development of multiple personalities for Bruce and the Hulk. Years later, during the Chaos War, Brian actually emerged on Earth as a fearsome Devil Hulk of his own before he was defeated and returned to the afterlife. More recently though, Brian made a lot of trouble in Immortal Hulk as a servant of the One Below All, and he even gained the ability to possess other gamma-infected human beings. Now Brian Banner himself had two sisters, but the one we want to talk about is Elaine Banner Walters, and her husband, Morris Walters. Their daughter, the lawyer Jennifer Walters, is Bruce Banner's first cousin and probably the closest thing he has to a sibling. It just so happened that as Bruce was seeking legal aid from Jennifer, she was nearly killed during an assassination attempt. Bruce saved her life by giving her an emergency blood transfusion, but as a result, she became the She-Hulk. Although she started out as a bit of a savage She-Hulk when she first appeared on issue 1 of her comic in 1980, Jen's personality eventually became dominant when she was in her gamma-powered form. In fact, she actually prefers being She-Hulk and put her skills to use as an Avenger and member of the Fantastic Four at one point. In case you've missed any of the ads, she is also the focus of the MCU's She-Hulk attorney at law. Now, the first love of Bruce's life was Betty Ross, the daughter of General Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross. Betty and her father both actually became Hulks as well. For Betty, the villain MODOK realized that her exposure to Bruce Banner set her up as an ideal subject to become a new Hulk. In Incredible Hulk number 168 from 1968, Betty was transformed, but not into another She-Hulk. Instead, she actually turned into a terrifying harpy who hated the Hulk for the passing of her husband at the time, Glenn Talbot. Betty was soon cured of her harpy persona, but she was ultimately killed by exposure to Axis gamma radiation by the Abomination. Fortunately for her though, MODOK and the Intelligentsia resurrected Betty and she became the Red She-Hulk. However, in the Immortal Hulk series, Betty once again has been transformed into the Red Harpy. I hope that wasn't too confusing. Now, as for her father, no one hated Bruce Banner more than Betty's father, General Thunderbolt Thaddeus Ross, a military general who became obsessed with stopping the Hulk at any cost. That's why it took everyone by surprise when Ross actually turned out to be the Red Hulk, who is a fiery and power-draining gamma mutate. Ross made the mistake of partnering with the Intelligentsia, who tricked him and turned him into the Red Hulk, using energy siphoned off of the original Hulk. Ross embraced his newfound Hulk powers, proving to be an incredibly powerful and capable hero. Bruce and Ross eventually did make an alliance to take down the Intelligentsia, and Red Hulk was actually invited to join the Avengers. Ross was eventually depowered, but as of Captain America number 26 from 2018, he is once again the Red Hulk. Now, when the Hulk was banished from Earth by the Illuminati during Planet Hulk, he crash-landed on the planet Sakaar, which is where the Hulk met his second wife, Kaira. Although Kaira appeared to die in the destruction of Sakaar, she actually gave birth to Bruce/Hulk's first children, Scar and Hero Kala. Scar became an incredibly powerful warrior with a vendetta against his father, but thankfully Scar and Bruce reconciled before becoming a formidable father and son team. Unfortunately for Hero Kala, his taste for power and vengeance corrupted him, and he also nearly destroyed the Earth in Incredible Hulk's number 617, before his father and brother sealed Hero Kala within the center of an alien planet. Hulk's other daughter is a bit trickier to explain. The short version is that Lyra is a daughter of the Hulk and Thundra from the alternate future timeline of Earth 715, where only 5% of the female population were fertile. Hulk and Thundra were never actually a couple. Instead, Thundra collected the Hulk's DNA from his saliva during a fight and immediately traveled back to her alternate future, where she used that DNA to create Lyra, who is basically a She-Hulk, and actually gets weaker the angrier she gets instead of stronger, meaning she has to reach a meditative state to reach peak power. Now, Lyra eventually came to live in the present alongside the Hulk, Jennifer Walters, and her extended Hulk family. Finally, in terms of Hulk romances, we have Jarella, the princess of the subatomic kingdom of Kai. She was never married to the Hulk or Bruce, but she loved both halves of him very much, and he also loved her. Their bond was so important that Jarella definitely is included on this list, despite the fact that she tragically passed away before they could wed. From Hulk's actual family to those who are essentially his family by association, his friends and allies, starting with none other than Rick Jones. If not for Bruce's timely rescue, Rick Jones could have been the first Hulk, but instead, he was spared from that fate and became one of Bruce Banner's closest and most trusted friends. In Incredible Hulk number 325 in 1962, Rick did actually get a little taste of Hulk power when he fell into a chemical pool that was being used to merge Bruce and the Hulk back into a single being once again. Rick emerged as as a Hulk, but he was cured a few chapters later in issue number 332. It wouldn't last long though, as thanks to the meddling of the intelligentsia yet again, Rick was mutated into a new version of Abomination in Hulk number 2 in 2008. As this new Abomination, Rick actually retained most of his personality, and so he renamed himself A-Bomb, so he could be a bit more heroic, which was a good choice, Rick. Good job. Rick was also horrendously mutated in Immortal Hulk before his humanity was finally restored in the limited series Gamma Flight from 2021. Doc Sasquatch, or Doc Samson. Doc Samson is one of the few members of the Hulk/Gamma family who willingly transformed himself. It happened in Incredible Hulk number 141 in 1962 when Bruce Banner was temporarily cured of his Hulk persona by removing the excess radiation from his body. Samson couldn't resist taking that power for himself, but he wasn't turned into a full Hulk. Instead, he was given superhuman strength and a striking head of green hair, likely due to his psychological makeup with him wanting to be a hero. In Immortal Hulk, Doc Samson got trapped in the below place and instead resurrected into the body of Walter Lankowski, also known as Sasquatch. He then became a green-haired version of the Sasquatch. Despite his great strength, Samson's greatest contribution to the Marvel Universe has been actually as a therapist for heroes and villains in need. During the event World War Hulk, Amadeus Cho was one of the few heroes who stood by the Hulk in his battle against the Illuminati. This was fueled by Amadeus's unshakable assertion that the Hulk is actually a hero and not a monster. Now, years later, in Totally Awesome Hulk number 1 from 2015, Amadeus got his wish to become a Hulk as well. As revealed in issue number 4, Amadeus absorbed the excess gamma radiation from Bruce, saving his life while transforming Amadeus in the process. It was a burden that he was more than happy to accept. However, not even Amadeus's intellect and personality could keep the negative aspects of being a Hulk at bay forever. After briefly losing control of his other self, Amadeus willingly depowered himself, but he still retains a significant amount of gamma powers as an agent of Atlas. The Juggernaut, Agamemnon, Glenn Talbot, the Red King, MODOK, Ravage, Wendigo, the UFOs, with a special shout out to Absorbing Man, are all villains that come into conflict with the Hulk. We have already talked about his longest lasting foe, Thunderbolt Ross, or the Red Hulk, but what about his other big bads? Starting with probably the most iconic of the Incredible Hulk's rogues gallery is the one and only Abomination. A dark mirror image of the Hulk, former soldier Emil Blonsky becomes the monstrous Abomination in an attempt to stop the Hulk, being mutated by a gamma machine that was created by Bruce Banner. On countless occasions, Abomination has taken on the Hulk in a one-on-one match. While he's lost time and time again, there have been times where he did give the Hulk a run for his money and even took down the people Hulk loves and cares for. Abomination makes for a fantastic villain, and there's a reason Marvel keeps bringing him back. For someone like the Hulk, a villain with higher intelligence is far greater than someone with equal strength. Samuel Stearns was once a normal man who was exposed to a high level of gamma radiation, just like mostly everyone else. The radiation gave him increased intelligence, a really big head, literally, and turned him into the leader. A foe who has time and time again outsmarted and worked around the likes of the Hulk. The leader's almost always 5 steps ahead of Bruce Banner and manages to bring the Hulk down despite his immense strength. And lastly, it honestly makes sense that the most terrifying foe for the Incredible Hulk is actually himself. While the Abomination can be seen as a dark reflection of the Hulk, the Maestro is literally a future evil version of himself. Coming from one of the comic's best Hulk story arcs, Future Imperfect, the Maestro is the last hero who survived an apocalypse and set himself to become the ruler of dystopia. Stronger than his past self and with all the intelligence of Bruce Banner, the Maestro has proved himself to be the strongest and most brutal Hulk villain out there. The Inhumans are an offshoot of humanity that was genetically altered by the Kree centuries and centuries ago. They mostly kept to themselves, hiding from humanity in their city of Adelan. The Inhumans developed a highly technological society that only got more advanced with the discovery of the Terrigen Mists that would give the Inhumans fantastic abilities. Inhumans age much slower than normal humans do, usually living for around 150 years, thanks to selective breeding overseen by the Genetic Council. And as such, each generation of Inhumans is long and honestly relatively unknown. Each Inhuman spouse is predetermined and they are limited to 2 children, which makes our job easier, at least when they actually follow the rules. But when talking of the Inhuman royal family, also known as the House of Agon, it can be traced back at least 2 generations. Starting with the first generation. The first 4 families whose roots grew into the different key members of the royal family we know today. They were Simak and Tanith, who together had Agon, who the house is named for, and his brother Korath. Magnar and Zeta were another couple who together gave birth to Mander and Rinda. There was also Kobar and Law. These two produced Azure and Amber, which kind of sounds like a Pokemon generation. And finally, there was an unidentified 4th pair who spawned 2 children, one of which was identified as Quellen, and the other is still unknown. Who this family member is just hasn't really been talked about. Honestly, a lot of the Inhuman royal family history isn't known, being only given to us in brief little flashbacks, with information that is really only key to the story it's being told in. But from here, the royal family splits even more into the 2nd generation and their children. Here we see the offspring from each of these original 4 families come together in different combinations. But first, if you're enjoying this video, make sure to drop a like. That's all you gotta do to let us know that we're doing a good job. Now, starting with the royal family's namesake, Agon, son of Simak and Tanith, was betrothed to Rinda, the daughter of Magnar and Zeta. Agon and Rinda were seemingly the first who began producing offspring around 100 years ago. Now, their first child was named Blackagar Baltagon, or simply Black Balt. Agon decided that Black Balt would be exposed to the Terrigen Mist while he was still in the womb. Shortly after Black Balt was born, they discovered he had awesome powers. These powers were complete control over the electrons around him, and the power he is most well known for, an incredibly powerful hypersonic voice that at first he could not control. Both Agon as well as the Inhumans Genetics Council, who play a large role in governing the Inhumans, came to agreement that Blackagar needed to be confined until he had control over his powers, when he was around 19 years old. Blackagar's voice can cause mass destruction with even a whisper, and if he screams or yells, he could potentially wipe out an entire planet. Luckily, he has learned to communicate without speaking and uses a tuning fork that helps him control his powers. It was actually thanks to the power of Black Balt that Agon became ruler when the last ruler, the Unspoken, tried to hide the Slave Engine, which is a powerful Inhuman weapon. But Black Balt is not the only offspring of Agon and Rinda. There was a 2nd child, Maximus, sometimes known as Maximus the Mad, who appeared to develop mental mind control powers after being exposed to the Terrigen Mist. At its peak, Maximus can override the minds of countless others, or even enhance his own mind. He can blank people's minds or control their actions for as long as he concentrates. As with a lot of families in comic books, there is almost always a black sheep. For Asgard, that is Loki. For the Eternals, it's usually Druig, and for the Inhumans, Maximus takes that title, as he is particularly dangerous, being both a mind manipulator and a genius, naturally gifted with the ability to invent all manner of powerful machines, but with the younger brother complex that has him believe he is the one who should rule the Inhumans. Now, outside of the direct Agon line, there were more who make up this royal family. Korath, the son of Simak and Tanith, married another Inhuman woman named Melina, who together had a son named Gorgon, who was also exposed to the mist as an infant. Through the Terrigen Mist, Gorgon developed cloven hooves and incredibly powerful bull-like legs that could cause huge shockwaves capable of creating earthquakes when he stomps. He is one beast of an Inhuman and usually serves as a bodyguard for his cousin and eventual king, Black Balt. But he also served as a mentor for younger generations. Next up, we have Mander, the brother of Agon's spouse Rinda, and by extension, the brother-in-law to Agon himself. Mander formed a union with Azure, the daughter of Kobar and Law. Together, Mander and Azure had their first son Triton, and exposed him to the mist when he was an infant as well. But for Triton, the mist had a pretty extreme effect, turning the boy into a fish-like humanoid and water breather who needed to remain in an isolated aquatic alcove off the coast of Madeline in order for him to survive. Later though, adaptive devices were developed to allow Triton to join the other Inhumans on land. Because of Triton's extreme transformation, when Mander and Azure had their second son, Karnak, they did not expose him to the Terrigen Mist and urged him to remain unaltered, as they didn't want to potentially be separated from both of their children. Instead, Karnak became my absolute favorite Inhuman when he was sent to the Tower of Wisdom Kingdom, where he was trained in various mental disciplines and inhuman martial arts, becoming a master and developing an ability that allowed him to see the flaws in any person, object, plan, or even concepts like, at one point, death itself. He usually plays the role of an advisor in the royal family as well as a bodyguard and strategist. Lastly, Amber, the other daughter of Kobar and Law and sister to Azur, married Quellan, who, if you remember, is the Inhuman whose parentage has not been established at this point yet. Together, Quellan and Amber had 2 children. The first would be Medusalith, or just Medusa, who would be betrothed to the future Inhuman king, Black Bolt. Medusa gained the ability to control the growth rate and movement of every strand of hair on her head, also known as trichokinesis. She maintains this control even if her hair is cut off, but that is difficult to do as Medusa's hair is stronger than steel. Amber and Quellan, a few months after Medusalith's birth, had a second daughter, Crystal. Probably my second favorite Inhuman. Crystal's exposure to the Terrigen Mists gave her elemental powers to control fire, water, earth, and air, making her actually really powerful. Crystal is also probably the most public of the Inhumans, interacting with the heroes of Earth quite a bit more, having a relationship with Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, in the early days, and then being married to Pietro Maximoff, Quicksilver, and having a child with him. At some point, the House of Agon also exposed the bulldog known as Lockjaw to the Terrigen Mists, making him 1, humongous, but also 2, developing the power to teleport. Lockjaw was the loyal pet to Crystal, but also obeyed most of the royal family as well, using his teleportation to be a key member of the family and a very, very good boy. With these key Inhumans being who the story centered around for a long while in Marvel Comics, some have had children of their own. Keeping the trend of starting with the direct family of Agon, Black Bolt and Medusa had a son together named Ahura Boltagon. Now, Ahura was born without consent of the Genetic Council, and he had similar powers to his father, but after exposure to the mists and his banishment to Earth, his abilities were replaced with much more sinister ones, and he had quite the spell of madness, just like his uncle, Maximus. This led to him becoming a large threat to the Inhumans, and they worked very hard to try and treat him. After a whole hubbubaloo with Kang the Conqueror and Terrigenesis, Ahura has the ability to split his soul to create psychic phantoms that can possess others. He can also create psychic constructs and can astral project. Now, Ahura has a cousin in the form of Luna, the daughter of both Crystal and Quicksilver. She is the first ever Inhuman and mutant offspring, sometimes called an Inmutant. Very clever. The thing is, the cross of these 2 powerful species actually canceled each other out, leaving Luna as kind of a normal human being. At least at the start. When Luna was 6 years old, Quicksilver was depowered by the decimation of mutant kind. In an attempt to regain his powers, he exposed himself to the Terrigen Mists and brought Luna back to Earth with him, where he exposed her to some collected mist as well, believing this to be a birthright she had thus far been denied. The process was successful and granted Luna the ability to sense, remove, and alter the emotions of others at will. Next up would be the children of the tank of the Inhuman royal family, Gorgon. Gorgon loved and married another Inhuman by the name of Mira, who sadly passed away. Now, Gorgon had 2 children, presumably with Mira, who also gained animalistic qualities after Terrigenesis. Alecto, their daughter, gained pretty cool leathery wings that allowed her to fly, obviously. Her younger half-brother, Petrus, was pressured by his father into undergoing the process of the Terrigen Mist at a young age, during Thanos' invasion of Earth. After coming out of the mists, Petrus transformed into a more Minotaur-like form with a large bull or bison-like head, with a relatively normal human, or I guess Inhuman body. Last but not least would be the son of Karnak. When all of the Inhumans' Terrigen Mists was destroyed, Karnak handed his son over to Mr. Sinister in order to awaken his latent powers without the need of Terrigenesis. Interestingly, Lear gained the ability to amplify the powers of other Inhumans, but apparently this power could only be used one time, which has already happened, so we don't know if he has more powers waiting to rear their head. The only other large addition to the royal family would be when it was revealed that the Kree, who had experimented on humans to create the Inhumans, also carried out the same experiment on 4 other species on 4 different planets. This had been kept for thousands of years until the discovery of the Universal Inhumans, which is the group for all 5 of these Inhuman populations. These races were also implanted with a genetic memory that would give them the urge to unite together as one people. The genetic memory claims that the 5 queens, one of which being Medusalith of Earth's Inhumans, will join the one king who returns from the forever night and band together in a new holy land which will be known as New Hala. So basically, for a short period of time, Black Bolt had 4 other wives, being the queens of the other Inhuman societies, but they were all de-lifed, so it doesn't really matter anymore.
What is the Marvel Multiverse? Well, while it might feel massive, it's actually a small area of the Omniverse, which contains within it all possible multiverses that have ever existed. The Marvel Multiverse is made of divergent realities based on various possible outcomes for some of Marvel's most prolific events, with various actions and choices of those involved shaping various realities. Some of these realities also exist with similar characters and events, but simply displaced into different time periods. The Marvel Multiverse is believed to be limitless, stated to be so even by the Beyonder, who said there is a seemingly endless number of dimensions. The Book of Vishanti also confirms this, estimating there are literally a transfinite number, that is a number greater than infinity, of universes within the Marvel Multiverse alone. The Web of Life and Destiny is believed to act as a map of the known multiverse, where its nodes represent universes and the threads connecting them are believed to be people, chiefly spider totems, which of course connect the universes. While the DC Multiverse has a clearer point for its inception in the comics, the Marvel Multiverse was more developed over time, with a few key moments and key characters leading up to and explaining how it was shaped, instead of being wrapped up in one major event created to help sort of fix the continuity of its universe, which for DC was the event known as Crisis on Infinite Earths. Here we don't have a single event, but more a growth and expansion over time that led us to the definition of the Marvel Multiverse. When it comes to the beginning of the multiverse from a comic history standpoint, some cite the first Marvel Comics as its origin, Motion Picture Funnies Weekly issue number 1 from 1939, or more commonly known and accepted as the first Marvel comic, Fantastic Four issue number 1 from 1961, possibly also an important number in regards to the multiverse. These comics are considered by some to be the beginning of the multiverse, since technically, retroactively, it has existed within the world of the comics since then. How did we come to the idea of the Marvel Multiverse though? When was it first invented? How was it integrated? In reality, it was a bunch of tiny little steps that actually brought us to the concept of the Marvel Multiverse and the naming therein of the main reality as Earth 616 and the often numerical designations of other realities. Back in 1962, in Strange Tales issue 103, Johnny Storm gets his first glimpse into the multiverse when he travels to the 5th dimension, which would later be designated Earth 1612. In 1963, the multiverse began to expand in terms of our knowledge of its history in the comics, with various worlds including Subatomica and Earth 6311, aka Kang's Other Earth, showing up in Fantastic Four. The FF team in general would actually be really important when it came to establishing and defining areas of the multiverse and its rules, but aside from them, Doctor Strange would also be a key character when it came to the expansion and definition of the multiverse. In Strange Tales issue 126 and 127 from 1964, we follow Doctor Strange as he journeys into the Dark Dimension to do battle with its dread Lord Dormammu. And speaking of seemingly dark and terrible dimensions, the Fantastic Four would also have their own experience with one known as the Negative Zone in Fantastic Four Annual issue number 6 in 1969. The Avengers would also get in on the multiversal fun in Avengers issue 85, where we'd first travel alongside them to the reality of Earth 712, or Earth S, the home of the Squadron Supreme, at least one iterations of the Squadron Supreme at this point. The Fantastic Four series is also where the TVA, the Time Variance Authority, would pop up from time to time, although the organization would make its first appearance in Thor issue 371 in 1986. So it was a while before the Time Police showed up to, make sure the multiverse wasn't getting too mad. The multiverse expanded even more with the first What If comic series starting in 1977, which was all about revisiting events that had happened in Marvel Comics and answering questions surrounding possible differences that could have occurred, such as what if a hero had made another choice? How would the universe be changed? Creating multiple alternate universes just by answering these questions in each issue, some of which created such popular realities that they got their own series or line of comics, such as with the Spider-Girl series of the MC2 reality of Earth 982, which spun out of a What If issue, so pretty cool. When it came to defining the borders, if you will, of all these universes, there were a few people that were key. These people were instrumental in determining what to call this collection of worlds and the main continuity, as well as determining where the borders existed between various universes and multiverses. One figure of major importance in all of this was Mark Grunwald, also known for being the one to inspire the character Mobius M. Mobius of the Time Variance Authority. Grunwald was the first one to use the term multiverse when it came to describing the madness that was this booming and ever-expanding collection of possibilities and alternate Marvel realities. Grunwald first coined the term multiverse over at Marvel to describe this collection of universes, but he didn't stop there. He even established that the Marvel multiverse existed within a greater omniverse, which was the collection of all fictional multiverses and real-world multiverses so even our reality, that had ever existed. First to write the term Earth 616 in print was writer Alan Moore and artist Alan Davis in the story Rough Justice, which was in the Marvel UK anthology The Daredevils issue number 7, first released in 1983. Later on, this story would be reprinted in the more familiar Marvel UK series Captain Britain. The term is used by Saturnine, who uses it to differentiate Captain Britain, Brian Braddock, of the main Marvel universe from other members of the Captain Britain Corps. Here the multiverse was established as being protected by Merlin. The Captain Britain Corps were created to protect their own version of the British Isles, protecting all versions across the multiverse collectively. Or at least, that was what they did, before they were all killed at one point. Speaking of multiversal protectors, each universe also has a Sorcerer Supreme to protect it, and each universe also similarly seems to have their own Spider-Man or Spider-Person to protect it, as we learn with the revelation of the existence of destined spider-themed heroes known as Spider Totems, who are connected through the web of life and destiny. Going back to the Captain Britain origins for the term 616, it would also later be used in the USA-based Marvel Comics title Excalibur by writer Chris Claremont and once again artist Alan Davis, who is pretty key in actually getting the term Earth 616 out there and making it a thing. Dave Thorpe, the writer on Captain Britain prior to Alan Moore, was also mentioned in regards to the credit of the term Earth 616, and was named as such by Alan Davis, who obviously was super key to the integration of this term Earth 616 in the comics, having been there pretty much throughout and since the beginning of it. Why 616? Well, some claim that Thorpe picked it because it was the number of the beast. Many think of that as 666, but one of the earliest manuscripts of Revelation actually identifies that number instead as 616, and that it was used as a sort of commentary on his feelings about the modern superhero genre, which he apparently wasn't a huge fan of. Thorpe has apparently said that he came up with the number via numerology, taking the number of 666 and subtracting 50 to get 616. However, if you believe Alan Moore to have picked it, it was reportedly said by his son-in-law that Moore picked it at random because he liked the idea of a higher number Earth in comparison to lower numbered Earths in other multiverses out there, such as DC's multiverse, which usually has lower numbers for their alt realities, such as Earth 1 and Earth 2 and Earth 3. It's also theorized that the term 616 could have been chosen in honor of the first issue of Fantastic Four, with 61 resembling the year, 1961, and 6 resembling June, the 6th month, which was when it was released. Since its inception, this has been a formula sometimes actually used in the numbering of other universes within the Marvel multiverse, which is why it kind of makes sense that people think that's where 616 comes from. While many realities claim to be the futures of Earth 616, the 2099 reality of Earth 928 is believed to be the true future of Earth 616. But you know, with so many possibilities out there, even that claim should be taken with a grain of salt. Perhaps the truth of the matter is that Earth 928 is one of the more widely embraced futures among creators and fans. Earth 928, the 2099 future reality, and Earth 982, the MC2 reality, I would say hold top spots for greatest favorites for potential Marvel futures amongst fans. How did the Marvel multiverse come to be within the comics? The first firmament, one of the ultimate creators in the multiverse, was shattered by a war between its creations, the Aspirants, and the Celestials, where the Celestials were rebellious against the first firmament. The Aspirants instead frequently sought the firmament's approval, doing things only to please them. From the defeat of the first firmament, the multiverse was born and over time grew, leading the first firmament to at one point grow jealous Chrysalis and basically attack its personification, known as Eternity, during its 8th incarnation. That's right, you thought there was only one Marvel multiverse? No, there have been multiple iterations of the multiverse, which has been shown to be cyclical, with each incarnation of it ending in destruction and following that its rebirth, building up from ground zero, typically. One of the latest examples of this was the 8th incarnation, where after being destroyed by the Incursions and then turned into God Emperor Doom's Battleworld, it was recreated by Mr. Fantastic and the Future Foundation / Fantastic Four with the help of Molecule Man's powers. Although this incarnation is unique in the sense that it wasn't strictly built up from ground zero, so kind of breaks that status quo. After every cycle of a new multiverse being born, a new hierarchy also comes with it, which means that there is a power flux in regards to who could beat who in the highest part of the cosmic power spectrum, which typically, but perhaps not always, has the Living Tribunal ranked as most powerful. The MCU also seems to have their own multiverse, with the main continuity being designated within its own narrative as Earth 616 by those working at the Baxter Building. However, outside of their own multiverse, in the wider scope of the comic book multiverse, the main reality of the MCU was actually designated as Earth 199999. So that's a bit confusing. The multiverse was a concept first introduced in the MCU during the first Doctor Strange film, with the concepts of the mirror dimension and the dark dimension. Fairly fitting considering that even in the comics, Doctor Strange was one of the characters integral to introducing and shaping the multiverse. When it comes to the MCU multiverse, Phase 4 has seen a huge expansion of the concept, with shows like Loki expanding greatly on it with the variants and the TVA, and the animated series What If, inspired by the likewise foundational comic series of the same name, as well as films like Spider-Man No Way Home, which saw Sony's Spider-Verses incorporated into the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse, or MCM, as well. When it comes to Sony's Into the Spider-Verse franchise, this series also seems to have its own contained multiverse, separated from the MCU or the comics, although similar in many ways to the comics. It also makes reference to other animated Spider projects, implying that perhaps animated universes are connected via a Marvel animated multiverse or an MAM, although we kind of need to see more to know more about how that multiverse is structured, in my opinion. Where should we start? Okay, how about at the beginning, where all of this madness started with Venom. When this symbiote first appeared in the comics, it was believed and actually advertised as being simply a new look for Spider-Man's Peter Parker. However, fans didn't really like his new threads so much, and so the new costume was transformed into a new character, becoming Venom, a symbiotic alien made of black goo that came from outer space. Namely, as we'd learn later, from a planet named Clintar. We would learn that Venom had actually been cast out from the hive mind, the collective of Clintar symbiote minds, which connected them all. But where did Venom come from? Other than Clintar, I mean, who made Venom? Well, that is actually believed to have been Null, the one who also made the first symbiote, known sometimes as the All Black, Venom's oldest sibling. Daddy Null isn't just the father of Venom, you see. He is the father of pretty much all symbiotes that exist on Clintar, having created the planet and the race known as the God of Symbiotes himself, and as an eldritch god of darkness. Yeah, Null really old. But Null wouldn't just be a father to these many symbiotes. Honestly, Venom has more siblings than I have time to mention them all individually in this video, and many of them still remain unnamed in the comics as well. But trust me, they are all out there and there are a lot of them. Null can also be considered at this point a grandfather and even a great-grandfather when it comes to the Venom family tree, because after Venom came to Earth, it also ended up getting somewhat busy with itself, making other little baby symbiotes. That's what happens when you reproduce asexually. You don't get busy with other people, you just make babies. Venom and other symbiotes of Clintar besides are asexual when it comes to their reproduction, meaning that they don't need a mate to, well, mate. Although it should be noted that it wasn't until after Venom connected with his host, his, you could say, soulmate, Eddie Brock, that Venom would produce offspring. Do with that information what you will. Scientifically, however, symbiotes typically only ever give birth to one offspring, but Venom is a special case. It had symbiotic babies extracted from it at one point against its will, which challenged the normal reproductive symbiote status quo. So the Venom symbiote kind of breaks the mold when it comes to the limits of symbiote reproduction, at least as we know it to exist in the rest of the universe. Regardless of whether or not being with Eddie had any impact on the time when Venom reproduced, Eddie is still a very important figure in Venom's life and family tree, often being regarded as one of the symbiote's closest allies and basically Venom's life partner. Initially, when Venom came to Earth, it merged with Spider-Man, but was rejected by the hero. Upset and hurt by the rejection, Venom chose to bond with Eddie Brock, who also had his own reasons for hating Spider-Man. The two bonded over their hatred of the hero, and it often was what kept them together, at least initially. Venom has other hosts, but if we have time, we'll try to touch on that later. For now, let's talk about all of Venom's kids. The first and eldest symbiote among Venom's offspring would be Carnage. Carnage was actually born during a prison breakout. Eddie, you see, was locked away and was cellmates with notorious serial killer Cletus Cassidy. Cletus and Eddie did not get along, and in some versions of the story, Venom arrived right in time to save Eddie, as Cletus had planned to murder him in his cell. That's how much the two did not get along. Although to be fair to Eddie, Cletus really likes murdering people. So regardless of if they got along, a murder attempt would have probably been inevitable. Carnage was born as Venom broke Eddie out and the two escaped, which also in turn freed Cletus, who had now merged with Carnage. The symbiote bonded to Cletus's blood, which some have explained as happening due to it being newborn, and of course due to Cletus having a cut on his hand, where Carnage could enter through. As Carnage, the two bonded would prove to be even stronger than Venom, and would require Venom and Spider-Man to team up in order to take on Carnage during the Maximum Carnage crossover event, which is pretty crazy because, you know, they're enemies. Venom was supposed to be a bad guy. Although symbiotes usually only produce a single offspring, Venom was forced into producing more after they were kidnapped by the Life Foundation, which, you know, sounds like it would be a lovely scientific organization based on the name of it, but really, it isn't. The Life Foundation is usually more concerned with the safety of the wealthy elite than advancements or defenses to protect all life, as their name would or should imply. They managed to capture Venom and forcibly harvest 5 new children from it, 5 seeds if you will, who would become known as Phage, Lasher, Riot, Agony, and Scream, all of them symbiotes. The first 4 in particular would become quite close during the time with the Life Foundation, possibly because Venom was under duress while spawning these new offspring. These 5 children were not nearly as strong as Carnage was. As a result, Phage, Lasher, Riot, and Agony became used to merging together to create the hybrid symbiote. This was of course when they weren't busy with their own individual hosts. Lasher would actually be bonded to a dog at one point, which would then have private military personnel working in tandem with the symbiote bonded doggo. So that person that had a symbiote was like, my symbiote's a dog. And the other symbiotes were each bonded to private military personnel hired by the Life Foundation initially. Scream is more often associated with doing their own thing. The Scream symbiote was bonded initially with the schizophrenic Donna Diego, a Life Foundation security guard codenamed Strike Agent 4. Venom's final child, thus far anyways, I guess we'll see if Venom has any more children, is Sleeper. Sleeper is also a unique symbiote, and although it's not as powerful as Carnage, is seemingly more powerful than the Life Foundation symbiotes. It's kind of somewhere in the middle, I'd say. Sleeper was born with the assistance of Eddie Brock, who did his best to help the Venom symbiote through labor after discovering that the symbiote was expecting. This is probably the closest the two have ever gotten in terms of like a semi-shared pregnancy with each other. Initially, Venom hid the fact that they were expecting from Eddie, only hinting at the possibility, but eventually all was revealed and Venom confessed that they had been scared to actually share that information with their host. Eddie, however, stood by Venom and attempted to stay bonded to the symbiote while it gave birth to help give it strength. Sleeper was initially believed to have died while being born, but was later revealed to be alive and well, an overall healthy small little bundle of goo. Sleeper was also delivered with the help of Alchemex and would end up there to be studied, as was permitted by Eddie Brock and the Venom symbiote so long as the research being conducted on their baby was non-invasive. Venom would come to visit Sleeper regularly and was wary of the symbiote bonding with a host too early, as they were basically worried about the potential for Sleeper to be corrupted by a host, wanting to avoid the potential evil that Carnage had become. Which I get it, if you had your first child and they were like literally the worst of the worst, I feel like every time you had kids thereafter you'd be like, oh, hopefully this one isn't like an evil murderer. Goodness. Someone who would also become good friends with Sleeper was Dylan Brock, who is, yes, the son of Eddie Brock and his ex Anne Wang, the secret son of the pair. Apparently, when Dylan was conceived, Eddie and Anne both had been bonded to the Venom symbiote at the same time, and because of that, it was believed that Venom was also in part a genetic donor to Dylan's creation and birth. Anne herself was also surprised to find herself pregnant with Dylan after the experience of becoming She-Venom, while Eddie was also still bonded to the symbiote. So this wasn't necessarily a normal pregnancy for Anne either. Dylan is actually the current host of Venom, who has been tasked with looking after Dylan and keeping an eye on him during his father's absences. It wasn't until recently that Eddie and Venom learned of the existence of Dylan and how he was Eddie's, Anne's, and in a way, Venom's son. But the two together have wholly embraced the concept of fatherhood as they accepted Dylan into their family tree, working together to keep him safe, even when he was being hunted down during the Absolute Carnage event by a resurrected Carnage who sought to revive Null by absorbing the codices within the spines of all the former symbiote hosts on Earth, which was a pretty crazy event, but fortunately Dylan made it through. Yay! But how many of Venom's kids have kids? Is Venom a granddad? In the case of Carnage, yes, they are. Carnage has multiple children, so it seems father like son in terms of, breaking the mold on symbiote reproduction here. Carnage's first offspring is Toxin, who is widely regarded to be one of the most powerful symbiotes of all time, second only maybe to someone like Null or perhaps maybe Anti-Venom. I personally think Anti-Venom is also up there. Initially, both Carnage and Venom teamed up to hunt down Toxin, as both were concerned by the amount of power Toxin would wield. Fortunately, Black Cat and Spider-Man teamed up and protected Toxin, allowing the newborn symbiote to escape its relatives. Aside from Toxin, Carnage also gave birth to Scorn as a result of being experimented on in the process of using the symbiote and technology to create hybrid prosthetics. As such, Scorn is also part tech, kinda like a cyborg symbiote if you will. Then there are the symbiotes born from Carnage's own experiments with the Darkhold, one of which is Ray's, the other of which was bonded to Jubilila Van Scotter, and Unnamed, both of which are now believed to be deceased. The symbiotes, of course, not necessarily their hosts. They were seemingly used up in a fight against Chthon and Carnage, and so they're no longer around. I think Scorn at this point also might be gone. And we thought Toxin was gone, but I'm pretty sure Toxin's alive? Yeah, a lot of death. Doesn't go well if you're a Carnage offspring. Aside from children, grandchildren, parent, and main host, Venom has also had a slew of other influential hosts as well as genetic recipients and clones over the years. Here's a brief list of some of the most influential members of that extended part of their family, but not all of them because I'm running out of time here. Clone from a piece of Venom's tongue, we have Mania, or Maniac. Mutated clone, Anti-Venom. Dubbed the original host, Kree Telkar. Other than Eddie Brock, possibly one of the best heroic hosts we've seen for Venom, Flash Thompson, aka Agent Venom. Currently Agent Anti-Venom, because bonded with Anti-Venom. Widely proclaimed the worst and most cruel host, Lee Price. Famed host of Carnage, who also is bonded with Venom, Cletus Cassidy, and Superior Spider-Man / Venom, aka Freaky Friday Otto Octavius in Peter Parker's body with the Venom symbiote. And that's just some. While we'll be focusing on the 2015 Secret Wars event, it is important to note in the effort to avoid, any major confusion, if you are looking for Secret Wars books, to read or anything like that, this isn't the only Secret Wars event. It's not even the only one from Marvel. Secret Wars prior to 2015 was a 1984 12-issue crossover event, where the heroes and villains of Earth were teleported to a distant world, dubbed Battleworld by none other than the all-powerful Beyonder. The Beyonder had grown curious about the superheroes of Earth and wanted to learn more about their potential. On Battleworld, the Beyonder provided various different alien weapons and tech and promised bountiful rewards to whosoever was the first to slay their enemy. The original Secret Wars was written by Jim Shooter with art by Mike Zeck and Bob Layton. The 2015 event would share some similarities to the original, but ultimately be its own separate story. The main series was a 9-issue miniseries, and creators of the the 2015 event are Jonathan Hickman and Assad Rabish. Secret Wars spun out of the Infinity and Time Runs Out story arcs, which had all been building to this since pretty much 2013, with some wheels being put in motion even further back than that as well. During Infinity, Earth-stationed superheroes faced off against Thanos, who they believed was searching for Infinity Gems, or as they're known now, the Infinity Stones, when really he was searching for his mysterious son, Thane. Meanwhile, in space, our heroes joined with various empires across the cosmos to combat a new, seemingly unstoppable alien enemy, claiming to be the creators of almost all planet-based life, known as the Builders. During Time Runs Out, it would be revealed to everyone that the Builders had actually been destroying worlds because of incoming incursions, believing that the universe was basically flawed and needed to be rebuilt. Incursions happen when two or more worlds collide together, destroying all that are involved. The coming incursions were causing the destruction of worlds across the multiverse as they collided with one another, and it turned out Earth 616 was also at risk of this. Time Runs Out was about finding a way to avoid its destruction and, in the end, finally confront, accept, and kinda just prepare for it. When Secret Wars starts, Molecule Man, Doctor Strange, and Doctor Doom face off against the Beyonders, while the rest of the universe of Earth 616 and Earth 1610 prepare for the final incursion, with the two worlds set to collide with one another. Two major forces are leading the side of Earth 1610, the Maker with his Children of Tomorrow and Nick Fury leading S.H.I.E.L.D. And they're also kind of working together, but also kinda not. Earth 616, meanwhile, was mostly reduced at this point to infighting and preparing their own life raft to preserve the lives of those considered most valuable to the planet and to the life raft's constructor, Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic of the Fantastic Four. The Maker and the Cabal had copied the design of this life raft as well, each creating their own in turn. This will be especially relevant later on in the story, so make sure you note that. As it approached the final incursion point, Earth 616's life raft suffered a hull breach, and the Richards family, minus Reed, was separated and seemingly destroyed as the inevitable final incursion destroyed both universes. And Reed was pretty heartbroken over it too. He was like, "Not my family! Tried really hard." Following the destruction of both worlds, we'd get a time skip where readers would be teleported to a completely different world 8 years in the future. Although we wouldn't know that till later. A world known as Battleworld that is ruled by God Emperor Doom and his Sheriff Strange, along with their own multiversal police force, the Thor Corps. Doom also has the Foundation, who are dedicated to exploration and science instead of keeping the peace and enforcing the law. The Foundation is made up of Doom's family, led by his daughter Valeria Von Doom, with its team roster also including his son, Franklin Von Doom. Doom's wife and the mother of his children here is also Susan Von Doom. She's not part of the Foundation, I don't think. She's just there and she's still super cool. The patchwork Battleworld was seemingly created by God Emperor Doom, using bits and pieces from all the realities in the multiverse, but rebuilt in his own image. Battleworld would later be designated as Earth 15513. It appeared as though no one here remembered their life previous to their existence in this world, forgetting whatever life they had in whatever previous reality they hailed from. And in fact, this reality was also considered to be kind of the new main continuity, as we just previously learned that Earth 616 had ended. God Emperor Doom's Battleworld is also split up into various regions, with many of them centered around a specific category of hero, or simply a specific hero or a specific multiversal world, repurposed as a province in this patchwork new reality, or a region. There is a whole map that lists all of them, but for the sake of time, I'm just gonna briefly mention some of the key ones in relation to the main story of Secret Wars. Some of the important regions included Higher Avalon, the Kingdom of Utopolis, Bar Sinister, Doomstat or Castle Doom, the Kingdom of Manhattan, the Deadlands, and the Isle of Agamotto. We learned of civil unrest in Battleworld, with multiple people potentially plotting against God Emperor Doom, hoping to usurp him or to defeat him. We discovered that the Foundation found a raft, presenting it to Sheriff Strange and the Thor Corps to investigate it. This raft was mysteriously found to be older than time itself, at least older than time on Battleworld, which everyone thought was, you know, all there had ever been, and which they believed was exclusively brought into existence by the might and will of God Doom. Which, I mean, it kinda was, but it wasn't as old as they thought it was. It was said that Doom himself created the light that gave birth to all life. The raft that was discovered turned out to be the life raft of the Cabal. Thanos emerged from it and inquired as to where exactly they had ended up. He also did a bit of killing of people. That's the Cabal for you. Sheriff Strange made some reports to Doom before returning to the life raft to investigate the death of one of the Thor Corps, killed by, of course, as I said, the Cabal. He had sent the Thor Corps to quarantine and further investigate the raft after learning of its existence from Valeria and the Foundation. During his investigation into the murder, he found another surprising survivor in the life raft, Miles Morales, Spider-Man of Earth 1610. Yo, hey Miles, how you doing? Meanwhile, Doom revealed to Sue that he was doubting himself and his ability to act as the god the Battleworld needed and deserved. Sheriff Strange takes Miles to his Sanctum Sanctorum, here known as the Isle of Agamotto. Here Strange reveals that another life raft was found 3 years prior, which, it turns out, carried the survivors of Earth 616. Hey! Strange also reveals that he is one of the few people who know what is really going on, and the Battleworld is not actually as old as time at all, and he knows that. But it's really only 8 years old. That's when we found that out, coming into existence following the final incursion and destruction of the multiverse. Back on the Kingdom of Utopolis, where the Cabal's life raft was found, the Thor Corps continue to hunt them and eventually find and engage the Cabal in combat. Strange also reveals what really happened at the beginning of the story when he, Doom, and Molecule Man are seen facing off against the Beyonders. Turns out they were able to defeat them, and Doom ended up taking the power of the Beyonders for himself and using it to build his Battleworld. This Battleworld, making himself the god and the emperor of it. This revelation inspires everyone eventually to turn on Doom, but when a Phoenix-empowered Cyclops from Earth 616 stands against Doom, even his power proves not strong enough to defeat him. Phoenix is not going to bail us out of this one. Later, Sheriff Strange is confronted for betraying God Doom. Strange taunts Doom, claiming that Doom is afraid of the Earth 616 survivor Reed Richards, his sworn enemy. Doom, in response, kills his right-hand Strange. That's what you do when someone's like, I think you're just jealous. You're dead. Well, especially if you say that to Doom. He will just kill you dead. Doom holds a funeral for Sheriff Strange, but does not reveal the details of his death because obviously that would be suspicious, and does not give a reason either as to why he needs the Foundation to pursue the survivors from the raft who have since disappeared into hiding on Battleworld. He publicly blames them for Strange's death, but cannot explain how they escaped what would be his wrath in this instance. After all, he is a god. They shouldn't have been able to just get away, right? His own daughter, Valeria, even seems suspicious of this and definitely clocks it. This is the beginning of her suspicions on her father. Later, it is revealed that Doom's power comes through Molecule Man. Doom had been killing Molecule Men across the multiverse in preparation for the final incursion, in order to gain enough power to defeat the Beyonders. While he succeeded in doing so, the main reality Molecule Man was needed as he acted as a conduit for the Beyonders' power, helping to feed it constantly to Doom, maintaining in essence his godlike power level and abilities. Molecule Man warns Doom that Strange's death could be the beginning of the end for him. He's like, things are gonna unravel, I see it. Could be a thing coming, watch out. Also, bring me food. Please bring me food. The Foundation continues to search for the survivors of the rafts, some of which we learn have successfully infiltrated various regions of Battleworld, like Jane Foster's Thor, who managed to sneak onto the Thor Corps to create dissent from within. Flash forward 3 weeks, Battleworld is getting more chaotic as more and more people rebel against the God Emperor, with a secret rival appearing in a mysterious leader known only as the Prophet. While the hunt continues for the survivors of the rafts, only a few have been caught so far. Valeria learns of the source of her father's power and begins to become even more suspicious of him. However, later when the two Spider-Men, Peter Parker of Earth 616 and Miles Morales of Earth 1610, are sent by the two Reeds of Earth 616 and of course of Earth 1610 to infiltrate Castle Doom and find the source of Doom's power, Valeria, upon running into them, chooses not to join them for fear of the truth that, she'll likely uncover. She doesn't want to be suspicious of her dad, she just kinda is, The Spider-Men find Owen Reese, Molecule Man, and upon asking if they have anything for him to eat, Miles offers him a cheeseburger that he'd been keeping in his pocket. A kindness that will be super important later. After wolfing down the burger, Owen confesses upon being questioned by them that he is the force that fuels Doom's power source if you will. Finally, a full-scale rebellion rises up from all sides with Thanos tearing down the shield, which is an alternate version of the Thing turns out, who is convinced to collapse at Thanos' behest, the Prophet, who is revealed to be Maximus the Mad of the Inhumans, marching his army towards Castle Doom, Baron Sinister rebelling against his own Baroness, the Goblin Queen, and fellow nobles to fight against Doom, Baron Maestro also planning to secretly turn on Doom after defeating the rebels with his World Breakers, and even of course the Thor Corps, Doom's own police force, turning against Doom with mighty Thor Jane Foster leading them in arms. In the Deadlands, Namor and and Black Panther also rise up, with Black Panther leading a zombie army as King of the Dead. Star-Lord also joins the fight and helps to destroy Castle Doom by using a smaller splinter of Groot on the magical tree above the throne room, Yggdrasil, which transforms it into a giant, destructive Groot. I am Groot. So cool. Later, the Thing as the Shield sacrifices himself when he does battle with Franklin Von Doom, who controls basically his own Galactus, allowing himself to be defeated and killed by Franklin as Galactus after learning in this reality that Franklin is actually Susan's son, and still holding love for Susie even in this reality, even across the multiverse. This prompts Valeria to reveal the truth of this reality and how Doom truly got his power to her mother Susan. During all of this, Earth 616 Reed Richards and his Earth 1610 alternate, the Maker, use the battle as a distraction to sneak in and attempt to find Doom's power source themselves. God Emperor Doom easily kills Thanos before being temporarily struck down by the arrival of Namor, an Infinity Gauntlet wielding Black Panther, and of course their zombie horde. Meanwhile, the two Reeds find Owen Reese, who also asks them for something to eat, but unfortunately they have nothing to give him. The Maker attempts to betray his 616 counterpart, only for Molecule Man to intervene, freeing Reed and striking down the Maker. After Doom defeats Black Panther by destroying the Infinity Gauntlet, he realizes all this has been a distraction and heads to the chamber where Molecule Man is kept. Molecule Man also asks Doom if he has brought him anything to eat, which he of course also hasn't. Molecule Man thus declares that Reed and Doom are on equal ground in his eyes, neither of them had anything for him to eat, and the two begin to fight against one another. Reed claims that Doom could have done a better job with Battleworld, but his fear of losing it prevented him from doing so. Doom likewise calls out Reed for thinking he could have done a better job with the power Doom had. Reed admits that he did think kinda just that he would have done better in Doom's shoes. And Doom agrees that Reed likely would have done a better job as he gets ready to condemn Reed to death. But because both men agreed and Molecule Man is still right here watching all this, he decides to give the power of the Beyonders over to Reed from Doom, destroying Battleworld in the process in a blinding white light. As everything fades to white, we learn the world has seemingly returned to normal, opening on Black Panther in Wakanda, who is surprised and happy to learn that the plan to defeat Doom actually worked. A few minor changes, however, are revealed as time moves forward in this new main continuity, such as Miles Morales moving over to Earth 616 with his family being all brought along with him, all of them now alive and well, as opposed to being in the now destroyed Ultimate Universe, and as opposed to having his mom be dead, because that's what was going on before. This is revealed to be because Molecule Man claimed he owed Miles for the burger that he'd given him. As I said, it would be important. The Future Foundation and Fantastic Four journey across the multiverse, creating and mapping out various worlds and universes as they restore all of the realities, rebuilding together as a team and as a family. Reed oversees the rebuilding with major help from Molecule Man and his own son Franklin Richards. Doom is also brought back to life and is seen in his castle in Latveria. He would be given the belief that the Fantastic Four, and specifically Reed Richards, were dead, and as he took off his mask, we would see that his scars were healed, completely gone, as he began to laugh. The first Summers, Cyclops. Scott Summers was the first of the Summers family tree to appear in the comics. He made his first appearance in the X-Men issue number 1 in 1963. There Scott was introduced to us as a somewhat self-doubting character who would become a leader but still struggle to see himself as worthy of love and deserving of his own happiness. Scott operated as a part of Professor X's X-Men team under the codename of Cyclops, and when Professor X was called away on a secret mission, Cyc would take his place as team leader, often maintaining a position as leader of the X-Men throughout the years, both in a field leader and commander role. Even today, at the time of this recording, Scott is currently the leader of the X-Men in the current 2022 X-Men comics, almost 60 years later. When we first met Scott, we didn't know very much about his family life or childhood, but as we got to know him, we learned more about how he came to be the Professor's golden boy and his first X-Man, and along the way, we'd also learn about his mysterious childhood and family as well. Who exactly are the Summers? At least in regards to Scott's original family tree before he grew up, he had his own family, which is its own tangled web that we'll attempt to unravel later on. Let's start with the easy stuff. Scott's parents are his father, Christopher Summers, and mother, Catherine Ann Summers. Summers. Scott was the eldest in his family, but also had a younger brother, Alex. When Scott was young, his parents seemingly perished in a plane accident. Alex and Scott were saved by their parents, who gave them a parachute and got them safely out of the plane. As a result of this near-death experience, Scott would sustain permanent brain injuries that he still suffers from to this day. Scott would not only be plagued by this, but also by nightmares of these events, which he struggled to recall with clarity as a result of the brain damage he suffered that fateful day. We later learned, though, that Scott's parents didn't die in that exploding plane. Instead, they were actually kidnapped, beamed aboard a Shi'ar spaceship. Christopher Summers was a US Air Force pilot, aiming to become an astronaut, but after being kidnapped by the Shi'ar and escaping them, he became a space pirate, known by the name of Corsair. Christopher escaped his captors the first time almost as soon as he was kidnapped. At least, initially, that's what we were kinda told, but he was recaptured after he tried to rescue his wife, Catherine, who was and killed by Emperor Deken of the Shi'ar Empire in front of Christopher. Christopher as Corsair would find love again, though, with Hepzibah. Hepzibah, from an alien skunk-like race known as the Mephitissoids, would be among the group that would band together to escape Shi'ar captivity and become the star-faring group known as the Starjammers, which Corsair is the leader of, becoming like a new sort of family for Corsair. Alex and Scott, having no next of kin, would be taken in by an orphanage. But whose orphanage was it? You may have already guessed. We're talking about a surprise, often unwelcome addition to the Summers family tree, Mr. Sinister. That's right, this is where Mr. Sinister's obsession with the Summers family, chiefly Scott, started, when Alex and Scott were taken into the state home for foundlings in Nebraska, where Mr. Sinister was the head operator. He had his administrator secure the two boys. While Alex was later adopted by Andrew and Joanna Blanding, who would legally become his adoptive parents, Scott was not, and he stayed behind at the state home, where Sinister would often run tests on him in secret, becoming more and more obsessed with Scott and his genetics over time. Eventually, however, Scott would run away, running into Jack Winters, known as the superhuman criminal Jack O'Diamonds, and would later be rescued from Jack with the help of Professor X, who would then recruit Scott into his school for gifted youngsters, and later his mutant team acting as sort of a father figure to him. Alex, however, wouldn't only receive new foster parents, but also a new foster sister, Haley Blanding, who's also part of our family tree. The Blandings actually adopted Alex to help them heal from the death of their son, Todd Blanding, and in a way, they wanted him to replace the hole that Todd had left in the family, kind of also making him like be the new Todd. Yeah, it's pretty messed up. Unbeknownst to both Alex and Scott, they both had a secret younger sibling. Their sibling wasn't a secret because, you know, their parents had like kept their existence from the two boys, but because Kate actually hadn't known she was pregnant at the time of the flight. As she was killed, the baby in her womb was taken from her and placed by Emperor Deken into an incubator accelerator, which caused the baby to grow quickly into a young man. This mysterious younger brother is the man that is known as the third Summers brother, Gabriel Summers. He would become known more commonly, though, in the comics as Kid Vulcan and then later just as Vulcan. In fact, for many years in comic book history, readers would be left on a cliffhanger surrounding his existence, as it was first alluded to by Mr. Sinister back in 1993 in the second volume of the X-Men in issue number 23. However, it wouldn't be till 2005's X-Men Deadly Genesis series that we would actually get to meet this third brother and have his true identity revealed to us. There's also the weirdness that in Deadly Genesis, it's established that Kate was only days away from having the child. Yet, in the original art where she is shown to have been made to join Emperor Deken's harem and then she's killed, she looks very non-pregnant. There is also the fact that it mentions she was only 2 months pregnant when first abducted, which actually applies that Corsair's initial escape attempt didn't actually happen as soon as maybe we originally thought it did, or it was originally implied, if she was only days away from giving birth, so he would actually have been in captivity then for a few months. Aside from that weirdness, we would also learn that Kate also had several children with Emperor Deken, that is, genetically speaking. Daken had these offspring created with the hopes of expanding the genetic potential of the Shi'ar Empire by introducing different kinds of genetics into it. When he was young, Adam was taken from the lab he was created in by Jonath, who became his adoptive father, hiding Adam's true origins from him. Adam would grow up and later become known as Adam Naramani, or codename Adam X. And originally, as he appeared shortly after Sinister alluded to Scott having multiple brothers, not just Alex, it was believed that he was the one, other than Alex, that Sinister was referring to. Adam X was a half-brother to Alex and Scott, but later Gabriel would be implied to be, you know, that extra brother, although Sinister could have been talking about both or either for all we know, really. Adam is of course both tied to the Shi'ar royal family and to the Summers family tree, as he would later learn. Between the three brothers, each had their very own different life experiences, which would lead them to having different kinds of families. So before we move on, let's go forward and talk about some of their kids. The Summers children and weird relations. I feel like for the Summers brothers' families, it is easier for me to go in reverse order from youngest to oldest. So let's start with Vulcan. Vulcan, after being rapidly aged to his prime years, was enslaved by the Shi'ar and sent to Earth to serve the Emperor's envoy there, but instead ended up escaping and was found by Moira McTaggart, who took him in and had him join her own roster of mutants. His story training with Moira is introduced in Deadly Genesis. Vulcan is known for being the most powerful of the Summers children. Vulcan would end up in space after being recruited to a mission to save the original X-Men and kind of failing somewhat. Vulcan would return to the Shi'ar Empire, end up in prison, freed, married to Deathbird, and later on would also become Emperor of the Shi'ar Empire. Which, yes, this does mean that the Naramanis would have become his in-laws, including Daken, who killed his mother, imprisoned his father, and enslaved him. Wow, that's a messed up family right there. Which also makes Adam X both Vulcan's half-brother and his nephew. Pretty wild stuff. Deathbird and Vulcan would have a baby together, although we still don't know that child's name, if it's still around somewhere. Deathbird being a mother was even acknowledged as recently as the 4th volume of New Mutants issue number 5 from 2020. And well, that's really all there is to Vulcan thus far. Now let's talk about Alex. Alex would grow up to become the mutant hero and sometimes villain known as Havoc, and it's no wonder he sometimes turns a little evil considering how rough his life was both leading up to joining the X-Men and even after that happened. Alex was given his codename and original costume by Larry Trask after being taken captive by his Sentinels. Alex would attempt to refuse to join the X-Men multiple times, but eventually it kind of just became inevitable. Originally, Sinister believed his power levels to be greater than Scott's. Initially, Mr. Sinister actually suppressed Alex's mutant ability when it first manifested when he was a child. He put psi blockers on him and wiped his memory of the incident that triggered it, as Alex's powers were considered to be too uncontrollable. They would only be triggered again later when he ran into an X-gene copy of himself in mutant-human hybrid, the Living Monolith. Yes, the Living Monolith is here! Amit Abdul, who had been mutated by Apocalypse using Alex's DNA, making him like a genetic brother of sorts who was psychically linked to Alex. Alex would only have one daughter that we know of, surprisingly not with any of his more popular romantic ships, but instead with Janet Van Dyne, the Wasp. They had a daughter in an alternate timeline which has since been wiped from existence. She was pretty adorable and awesome, and her name was Katie, or Catherine Summers. In typical Alex Summers must suffer Marvel fashion, after having half his face melted by Kang, he is the only one left with memories of Katie, so he can't even talk to anyone about it. Janet doesn't even remember being with him or their daughter. I still kinda hope one day that Katie will get to return via the main timeline somehow. Finally, let's talk about the mad complexity that is Scott Summers' family tree, with Jean Grey, Madeline, Pryor, and beyond. Although Scott was always sweet on Jean, she became the Phoenix and later Dark Phoenix, seemingly dying, sacrificing herself to save others once she turned dark. It was after her apparent death that Scott met Madeline Pryor, spelled Madeline probably one of the most commonly misspelled names in all of comics. Madeline happened to look just like Jean. What a coincidence! Scott fell in love with her and left the X-Men to settle down with Maddie. Together, the two had a baby, Nathan Christopher Charles Summers, initially referred to in the comics as Baby Christopher. However, their relationship started to deteriorate when Scott decided to return to the new, old X-Men team, X-Factor, after Jean Grey was revealed to be alive and well, herself joining the team. Jean hadn't died, it turned out, out, but was simply in a stasis cocoon at the bottom of Jamaica Bay, while the Phoenix adopted her form and personality, appearing as her, later seemingly perishing. But of course, this is the Phoenix Force, so we know that that is not true. And, you know, it gets even weirder than this. The Phoenix Force, along with Mr. Sinister, were later revealed to be like parents to Madeline, who it turned out was a clone of Jean Grey created from a piece of the Phoenix Force. Surprise, surprise! No wonder she looked almost identical to Jean. This revelation, in combination with Scott abandoning her, would drive Madeline mad. Feeling abandoned, she would ally herself with Alex Summers and also take him for her lover. He would become known as her Goblin Prince, and she would become the villain known as the Goblin Queen, aiming to retrieve and later seemingly sacrifice Christopher, who had been taken from her by Mr. Sinister. And it gets somehow even weirder than that. After Maddie was dealt with, Jean would be given memories of raising baby Christopher, so psychically he was like her own child. Baby Christopher would later be taken by Apocalypse, saved by the clan Ascani, cloned, and later grow up across time, becoming a time traveler who we all know as Nathan Summers, or Cable. Nathan's evil clone, who was raised by Apocalypse, now also weirdly, I guess somehow in this family tree, would be known as Strife. Cable would rescue the mutant Messiah, meet a woman named Hope, who he fell in love with and married, and name the adopted baby mutant Messiah Hope Summers, after his wife and her adoptive mother. His daughter Hope had a biological mother before that who died, which we now know was named Louise Spaulding. Before being with Hope Summers though, Cable would be married to Aaliyah Dayspring, his first wife, with whom he had a son known as Tyler Dayspring, aka Genesis. But not Apocalypse's wife Genesis, or Apocalypse's younger clone Genesis, or Apocalypse's alternate universe son Genesis. None of those Geneses. In a weird twist, Aaliyah was also an initiate in the clan Ascani, who originally saved Nathan when he was a baby. The other weird thing about the clan Ascani is Mother Ascani, who saved Nathan as a baby, is also part of the Summers family tree, being a daughter of an alternate reality pairing of Scott Summers and Jean Grey. So Nathan as a baby was actually saved by his alternate reality stepsister, or you know, just sister if you consider Jean to truly also be his mother. Let's rewind back a little bit to after the X-Men beat Madeline Pryor during the events of Inferno. Scott would end up later married following his disastrous relationship with Maddie, of which he is actually a good deal responsible for, to be honest, to Jean Grey, his first love. They would not have children in the main continuity, but as we already know with Mother Ascani, had children together in alternate realities. While I won't mention all of those children here, two important ones in regards to their interactions with the main continuity are Rachel Summers and Nate Grey. Sometimes known as Ascani or Prestige or Phoenix or Marvel Girl, Rachel Summers is from the same reality as Mother Ascani, Earth 811, the Days of Future Past reality. And Mother Ascani is actually not necessarily an alternate version of her, as Rachel was actually split into separate beings across time when she sacrificed herself to save her teammate Captain Britain. Rachel is immensely powerful and previously lived on the blue area of the moon in the Krakoan habitat known as the Summer House. Not residing in the Summer House on the blue area of the moon is Nate, or Nathan Grey. Nathan Grey actually has a psychic link with his alternate reality self Cable, and is like Cable if he wasn't infected with the techno-organic virus, making him kind of like a more perfect being. Nate Grey is actually the genetic offspring of Jean Grey and Scott Summers, and was made by his reality's Mr. Sinister, who there is just known as Sinister, although he was also raised by his reality's Forge, so that's kinda like his foster dad. Nate Grey goes by the codename X-Man, and is basically like a mutant version of Jesus. He hails from the reality of Earth 295, the Age of Apocalypse reality. Initially, all we knew of Wolverine was that he was a mutant, and in fact, it was even suggested in the beginning that the adamantium claws that he possessed themselves were actually genetic. It wouldn't be till later that we'd actually learn the adamantium on his skeleton was actually added later on by Weapon X through a painful bonding procedure that few test subjects could survive, let alone benefit from, with the main time that we all kind of figured that out being when Magneto stripped the adamantium from him. That was a thing that was very memorable. Before he was Wolverine though, who was Wolverine? Well, if you ever asked Logan himself, he actually might struggle to answer this question due to all the tampering done to his mind, as well as years of both physical and emotional trauma that his brain had suffered and healed from. It's actually believed that the reason why Wolverine doesn't often remember things from his past is because his brain heals over painful memories, and that scar tissue and his healing factor's self-preservation instincts could contribute to memory loss. But also, Wolvie has been shot and stabbed in the head. a lot, which I think would mess with anybody's memories. If they could heal, definitely not. If you couldn't heal, well, you wouldn't have any memories because you'd be a dead guy. However, while Wolverine might struggle to remember his many pasts, fans of the characters likely won't, or fans that have read his many pasts anyways, including Origins. Before Wolverine was a superhero or even was known by the name of Logan, he was James Howlett. James grew up as a sickly child who actually was perhaps lucky that he even made it to the point of his mutant powers manifesting. Although I guess when you consider just how that happened and then everything that came after that and all of Logan's life, Logan might not see himself as being quite so lucky. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's head back to Wolverine's origins. James was raised as the youngest son of a wealthy couple, John Howlett Sr. and his wife Elizabeth Howlett, who lived in Alberta, Canada. However, in truth, he was actually the biological son of Elizabeth and the Howlett's groundskeeper Thomas Logan, born out of an affair between the two. At least, that's what's heavily implied. John Sr. Howlett may have still been James's biological father, but as I said, it is heavily implied that he was not. Still, John raised James as if he were his own anyway. Whether this was because he was not aware of his wife's affair or simply because he just felt it was the right thing to do, despite her infidelity, seeing James still as one of his own. We don't really know that much about John Sr. Howlett, although he seemed to have a kind heart, but it is implied that he was the one to deal the death blow to John Jr., James's older brother, doing so in defense of their mother, Elizabeth, after John Jr.'s powers, because he also had powers, manifested and he went into a rage. This likely weighed on John Sr. heavily. Also, yes, if you were wondering, Wolverine had a brother. We'll talk about that more in a bit. Elizabeth Hudson Howlett was Wolverine's mother. Hudson was Elizabeth's maiden name and would actually be a very important name when it came to Wolverine's story later in life, but we'll get back to that in a bit. And it seems likely that when it comes to Logan's X gene, he may actually get it from her side of the family or from his biological father's side, or a combination thereof, though more than likely I think it's from Elizabeth's side of the family. She gave birth to not one mutant, it turns out, but two! Though both sons may have been fathered by Thomas Logan, in the alternate reality of Earth 4011 that appears in Wolverine the End, it is stated that Elizabeth is where Wolverine gets his X gene from. Now of course that's not main continuity, but still some people feel like that's, could also apply to the main continuity. The traumatic and life-threatening experience she had with her first son is implied to be what caused her to be sent to a mental institution. Eventually though she would return, but life would forever be changed at the Howlett estate, with Elizabeth mostly preferring to hide in her room, even neglecting her younger son James as a result. As we have previously stated, young James also had an elder brother who passed away, John Jr. Howlett. John Jr. Howlett may have also truly been the biological son of Elizabeth and Thomas Logan, the groundskeeper, but we don't really know that for sure. What we do know is that John Jr. died young, after apparently also being born a mutant. It's believed that his father killed him out of defense of his mother, who he had attacked. Some believe to this day that John Jr. may even still be out there somewhere alive, possessing powers similar to Wolverine, despite the fact that Wolverine seemed to see his older brother during time spent in hell, which I think would be pretty crazy if we brought him back, but also I feel like if we haven't seen him at this point, where has he been? Aside from his elder brother who passed away, young James also had a half-brother in Dog Logan. Dog was the son of Thomas Logan and an unnamed woman. He grew up on the Howlett estate and became one of James's playmates along with Rose, who was brought in to live in the estate as a playmate for James while also being given serving duties as she got older. Dog at one point saved James's life after accidentally endangering it. However, Dog's feelings for Rose and forceful actions towards her, as well as his jealousy of James and all that he stood to inherit, drove a wedge between them as they grew up. Eventually, this division led Dog to attack James, causing him physical and emotional harm, with Dog and his father evicted from the estate as a result of this. Oddly enough, Dog somehow survived to the modern age, despite having been born like Wolverine in the late 19th century. At one point, he has a bunch of time diamonds, which I guess he could use to time travel, so this could be how he's lived so long, or perhaps his longevity is still as of yet an undefined power of his. We haven't seen him for a while, but still, pretty sure we saw him at least in like 2014 or something, so considering it's the 19th century and then we see him in a comic from 2014, that's a little what's happening there? We don't know. Thomas Logan is heavily implied to be the biological father of James Howlett, which seems to have been why he used Logan as an alias in the past. Although, as I've said previously, James's mind also became so addled that eventually he would not remember his true name as James Howlett, and would forget the connection of that name, Logan, to his biological father. So he might have just picked that name he thought randomly, but it wasn't so random. In fact, when Dog Dog eventually comes to look for James and Rose years after they have fled the estate, James initially does not even recognize Dog or remember who he is or that he's a Logan. Thomas was a hard man, driven to drink and often behaving aggressively, especially towards his own son who lived with him, Dog. In fact, this is likely a big part of the reason that Dog turned out the way he did. After both Thomas and Dog were removed from the Howlett estate, Thomas snuck back onto the property, killing the Howlett servants and using Rose to gain access to Elizabeth's room, and of course bringing Dog along with him. There, Thomas attempted to get Elizabeth to run away with him before being confronted by John Sr., who Thomas then just killed. This is what caused James's mutant powers to manifest, as he sort of came into all this chaos, and in a blind fit of loss, desperation, and rage, he scarred Dog and killed Thomas with his bone claws. The trauma of the whole occurrence and its similarity to the tragic event of her first son proved too much for Elizabeth, who blamed herself and took her own life. James and Rose, also overwhelmed, chose to leave the estate, fleeing together. If you thought Thomas Logan was bad, well, I mean, you would be right, but while John Sr. seems like a well-meaning sweetheart by comparison, his own father was more akin to Thomas than his own son in terms of his cruelty. We don't know his name, but Mr. Howlett, or the Old Man, as he was sometimes referred to, is the grandfather of Wolverine and the father of John Sr. He was the one who forged the Howlett name and created their fortune through unknown means. The Old Man was critical of John Sr. and his offspring, and may have even at one point threatened the life of young John Jr. because of his mutant gene. He constantly harped on John Sr., criticizing his parenting skills as he felt James was too weak and too soft. After Dog blamed Rose for the deaths of Thomas, John Sr., and Elizabeth, Mr. Howlett disowned James, although he did still help him and Rose escape town, and years later would actually come to regret sending his grandson away, giving Dog, then his heir and ward, information to help track James and Rose down once more so that he might actually make amends. However, Dog, of course, had some other plans. He was like, yeah, I'll do that. I'll totally do that. I'm not gonna go and try to kill this person who stands to potentially take an inheritance away from me that I just got. Wouldn't do that at all! Oh yeah, he definitely tried to do that. From the beginning almost, young James's life was steeped in tragedy. A tragedy so great, in fact, that he wouldn't even remember most of it as time went on. That's how great it was. Not even Rose, who also tragically died by accident at Wolverine's claws during a fight between him and Dog, after Dog had tracked him down with information given to him by the Old Man. Wolverine would see Rose's spirit in visions when close to death, but not remember her or his own past. He would often mistake her for Jean instead, which kinda makes sense because Rose and Jean do look very similar. And Jean herself has also, of course, appeared in Wolverine's death visions in spirit form. Often too, because you know, half the time Jean happens to be dead in the comics, it seems anyways, so that makes sense. However, this is only the beginning of Wolverine's tragedies. Tragedy would plague Wolverine throughout his family tree, even extending through his mother's heritage and her own family, the Hudsons. Elizabeth Hudson had two brothers, Elias and Frederick. Both survived their parents, who died tragically in a shipwreck. Everything is a tragedy when it comes to any story attached to Wolverine. Even his mother's family couldn't escape this comic book curse. Elias seems to have been the older brother, as he was the one who ended up running the family business, the Hudson Bay Company, which by the way is a real department store company that has strong ties and roots in Canada, so I kind of love that the Hudsons are related to the Hudson Bay Company. Wolverine even at one point unknowingly works for his uncle Elias, who was later driven to take his own life, shortly after Wolverine left. Mental health seems to be something that the Hudsons struggled with throughout their history. Probably something Wolverine should watch out for. Actually, I feel like Wolverine has also struggled with that, so I mean, we all struggle with that, so fair enough. Frederick, however, ended up working with the Canadian military, overseeing a training facility, a facility that ended up being used by notorious and often confusing Wolverine villain Romulus, who was retconned to have been the mysterious figure making Wolverine's life even more tragic the whole time. Like he even needed help in that department at all, Romulus, jeez. And of course, as Romulus enters the equation, here is where Hudson's involvement with Wolverine gets really weird, but kinda great, but really weird. Logan ended up at the military training facility where Victor Creed, aka Sabretooth, and Silas Burr, aka Cyber, and currently known as Hornet, would also be. Under orders from Frederick, who did not know that Logan was his nephew, Burr was instructed to make Logan's life living hell in order to turn him into a loyal killer. Another of Romulus's agents, Janet, was also used to manipulate Logan through having him fall in love with her. But not, of course, so she could persuade Logan to do what she wanted, as you can kind of do with people that, love you. You can kind of convince them of things. But unbeknownst to her, so she could be basically fridged, aka killed, thereby motivating Logan in one way or another. Another classic Romulus plot. Frederick himself would later be killed on Romulan's orders by his great-nephew Dakin, aka Akahiro, the son of Wolverine. Frederick never had any children with his wife, but did have an illegitimate son with his secretary, whom she vengefully named Frederick Hudson II in order to hurt Frederick's relationship with his wife. Take that, Frederick. His secretary Caitlin MacDonald took her own life sadly shortly after giving birth. While Frederick didn't do much of note in his own life, he did have 3 sons who are pretty relevant: Truett, Victor, and James. Frederick II himself died young as the result of a bar brawl, which is a pretty fitting way to go for anyone who's related to Wolverine. Truett Hudson, often referred to simply as Wolverine's cousin, though more specifically Wolverine's first cousin once removed, is one of the most important of the 3. Truett is also known in the comics as the Professor, and while he is also bald, we are not talking about that professor, not Charles, aka Professor X. Instead, Truett was the Professor, also known by the alias Professor Thornton, who became tied to the Weapon Plus program, likely inspiring it as a result of stumbling into a lab in a World War II German camp that actually belonged to, get this, Nathaniel Essex, aka Mr. Sinister. What a strange connection I never thought would exist, and yet it does. From there, Weapon Plus would later spawn the creation and project known as Weapon X, on their journey to create new super soldiers. This was following the success of Project Rebirth, which led to the creation of Captain America, who was labeled by the program as Weapon 1. The Professor would later be put in charge of brainwashing Team X operatives, among them Logan included, and would be known as Director of the Weapon X program. Yeah, that's the thing. That is literally his first cousin once removed, who was running that program. Truett actually also has ties to Dracula, another famous Wolverine enemy. Truett himself would be killed, seemingly and surprisingly, by Silver Fox, who at this point was believed to have actually been alive this whole time, and also now be evil and working for Hydra. And if you don't remember Silver Fox, she's one of Wolverine's first loves. However, in this reality, this probably wasn't actually Silver Fox, but a mutated clone of her. At least, all us Silver Fox fans are hoping that's what happened. Hopefully it's not really Silver Fox. To this day, I think a lot of people say, that's a clone. Victor is the middle child of Frederick II's. He himself was also manipulated by Romulus, because isn't everyone? He acted as Romulus's right-hand man and was shown to be extremely durable and strong, although I don't know if we ever found out if he was a mutant or not. Victor was also born mute as well as blind. He met his end at the hands of Wolverine. Continuing right along with the 3 McDonald Hudson brothers, we also have James Hudson. That's right, Guardian of Alpha Flight. Andrew, are you proud of me? I found a way to work Alpha Flight into this video. Although considering Wolverine's history with the team, that really shouldn't be hard in general to do while talking about him, because he himself has also, been a pretty good ally and sometimes team member of Alpha Flight. But anyways, this isn't about Wolverine's life story. This video is about his relatives and his family connections. Enter James Hudson, also Wolverine's cousin and half-brother to the villainous Truett. Half-brother because all 3 brothers actually had different mothers. James was the youngest of the 3, which means I got to save the best for last. Before Guardian was Guardian, James Hudson developed a suit for Amcan Oil Corporation to be used to help locate underground oil deposits. However, after he learned his suit was going to be sold to the US military and used as a weapon, which he was not here for, he destroyed its plans and stole the helmet of the suit, making it unusable. He then went to the Canadian government for help and protection from Amcan Oil. He would go on to become founder of Department H and the leader and founder of Alpha Flight. James Hudson and his wife, Heather McNeil Hudson, aka Vindicator, would also become fast friends with technical relative James Howlett, ever since they ran into a feral Logan on their honeymoon as seen in Alpha Flight issue number 33, which has a flashback to that. James and Heather have one daughter together, Claire, who would be, I think, a cousin twice removed to Wolverine. So that's also a thing. John Sr. and Elizabeth aren't the only ones with relatives relevant to Wolverine's history though. Thomas and the Logans also have an extensive past, and at least one relative that you might find at least interesting. Folkburn Logan. If Wolverine were to run his DNA through someplace like Ancestry.com, he'd learn that 1, he probably has a lot more kids than he ever knew about, and 2, that he was also related to Folkburn Logan. Folkburn lived back in the 11th century and is referred to by his fellow soldier and friend as the last pagan, living in London, England. Folkburn runs into Thor and the Horsemen of the Apocalypse during a fight between them, and is saved by Thor himself, just as he begins to pray to the old gods, hilariously, which I love, as seen in Uncanny Avengers issue number 6. While this pretty much covers all of Logan's family when it comes to where he comes from and his origins, there's a lot more tragedy ahead for us to explore when it comes to romance and his own offspring. We're running a little short for time on this video, so I'm going to briefly cover some of the major wives/loves and children we've come to know as related to Wolverine in the main comic book continuity of Earth 616. But if you enjoyed this video and you want a specific video about Wolverine's kids, let us know in the comments, or if you would rather perhaps something a little different, such as hearing me attempt to explain the history of Weapon X, or attempt to explain Mr. Sinister's family tree instead, both of which would probably also be a lot of fun. Be sure to let us know. When it comes to Wolverine's wives, there are two main ones that stick out to me, one of whom he was actually married to, another he was almost married to, but you know, I think we can still count her. She's a pretty big deal. Other than Jean Grey and his weakness for redheads, the major loves of Wolverine's life I would say would be Mariko Yoshida, his fiancée, and Itsu, his wife. Although Wolverine was also shown to be married to the ancestor of a person named Hoshiko in the story Aftermath in Wolverine Exit Wounds, and was once also married to Ophelia Sarkissian, aka Viper. That's a thing that happened. With Mariko, their love did not produce any offspring, but it was a strong love regardless, and they did have a foster daughter together, so that's a thing. Mariko was introduced in X-Men issue 118, and we'd come to know her as the daughter of Lord Shinjin, the leader of Clan Yoshida, a crime syndicate in Japan. Mariko is also a cousin to Mutant Sunfire, which was how she first met Wolverine. The two fell in love and eventually ended up engaged after the death of Mariko's father. However, due to the manipulations of Mastermind, their wedding would be called off. Later, it would be back on but delayed until Mariko felt she had made right the wrongs that Mastermind's influence over her had caused. She died before they could be married though. While she would be resurrected much later, her and Wolverine's relationship would never really recover. Itsu is the wife of Logan, who he met, fell in love with, and married during his time training with Bando Saburo in Japan. Itsu became pregnant but was unfortunately assassinated by Bucky Barnes, aka the Winter Soldier, before her child could be born. Initially, it was actually believed that their offspring did not survive, but later we learned that thanks to the power of the baby's X gene, it actually did survive. The baby was retrieved by Romulus, who left him on the doorstep of a well-off couple that would adopt him. However, Romulus would also manipulate this baby, named Akihiro, but cruelly nicknamed Daken, and now known by the codename Fang, to grow up to hate his father. His biological father, Wolverine, that is. Daken would attempt to destroy Logan while working for the Red Right Hand, seeking out those who were Wolverine's offspring that he either never knew existed or had forgotten about due to, once again, much tampering with his mind and just overall memory loss, and using those relatives as weapons against their father. This group was known as the Mongrels. They died at Wolverine's hands without him knowing of their true origin till after he'd killed them all. Tragedy. At one point, Daken and Wolverine would be pitted against one another by the machinations of Sabretooth, leading to Daken tragically being drowned by his own father in a puddle. But don't worry, he returned and later would reconcile with his dad, and now he isn't even known by the name Daken, but prefers to be addressed as Akihiro or Fang. Other prominent offspring of Logan's from the main continuity include Laura Kinney, aka X-23, who is also now known as Wolverine, his daughter and also his female clone, Gabrielle Gabby Kinney, aka Scout, a clone of Laura, who is also seen as Wolverine's daughter, and Amiko, his adopted daughter, who has spent a lot of time being raised by Wolverine's good friend Yukio, and previously was raised in part by Wolverine's love and fiancé Mariko, prior to her death of course. To really understand this team, we have to go all the way back to their humble beginnings over at Marvel Comics. The team supposedly came to be thanks to a group you're quite familiar with. No, I'm not talking about Marvel, and no, I'm not talking about legendary duo Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. I'm talking about us, the fans. Well, I mean, not me specifically, as I was not alive back in 1963, but the fans who were around back then and reading comics had a need for more Marvel team books. There were many solo hero books out there, but fans wanted to see more team-ups, and so Stan Lee and Jack Kirby came up with the X-Men. Stan Lee had said before that the challenge with team books where new characters were introduced was explaining how they all got their powers, their origins. To simplify this, he had an idea of making the entire team a group of mutants, using that same blanketed reason to explain how they each got their powers. Pretty easy, you can just say, hey, they're mutants. The brilliance of this is that while on paper this sounds like an easy, even lazier approach to some, it actually worked. A huge part of the reason why the X-Men were so successful and why we love them even today is because of their mutant status. Initially, Stan wanted to give them a simple name, denoting this status, the mutants. But publisher Martin Goodman turned down the name idea, citing the fact that no one knew what a mutant was. Some even believed that the name, the Mutants, could still be used as a good alternative name for the group when they debut in the MCU, but we'll have to wait to find out about that. Instead, Lee decided to take inspiration for the team's name from their leader and mentor, Professor X, calling them simply the X-Men. In those early comics created by Kirby and Lee, Professor Charles Xavier, or Professor X, as he'd come to be more commonly known, created a school for young mutants, guided by a dream of peaceful coexistence with humankind. You see, the public was not a fan of mutants, and there were many evil mutants out there that gave mutant kind a bad rap. To combat this, Professor X decided to create a school for gifted youngsters in Westchester County, New York, bringing together a team of young mutants using his telepathic abilities and Cerebro, which we later learned was actually created by X and his future student Jean Grey. The initial team and group of students that started it all were Cyclops, Beast, Angel, Iceman, and of course, Jean Grey as Marvel Girl. During these early days, they were also sometimes joined by Mimic, who initially was introduced as a deadly villain that could adopt the abilities and powers of those around him, making him a formidable foe for the X-Men, as he could, mimic all of their powers. However, Mimic would soon after be reformed, and after losing and regaining his powers kind of multiple times, would also end up adopting the OG X-Men roster's power sets permanently. These were the early days of the X-Men, which also introduced one of their greatest enemies, who coincidentally would also throughout the years become somewhat reformed before becoming a full-on anti-hero, or even to some, a full-on hero in modern day comics, Magneto, the master of magnetism, and his also quite infamous Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, who themselves would have many various different versions and rosters throughout the years. Eventually, the X-Men series was taken over by Roy Thomas, beginning with issue number 20. Throughout the continuation of the series, other writers would also help out, and we'd see characters like Havoc, Cyclops' heroically reluctant brother, who was also a mutant, and Polaris, who we later learned was the daughter of Magneto, having powers similar to him, introduced. This series would be ongoing until issue number 66, where it would come to a firm stop as sales dwindled somewhat. Up until issue 93 of the series, the X-Men title would only exist to sell reprints of older stories. So there's a period there where nothing new is really happening, it's just a lot of reprints. However, with Giant Size X-Men issue number 1, we'd see X-Men return in a big way, finally getting a new tale and ultimately a revival. Len Wein and Dave Cockrum were the creatives behind this first Giant Size, which would become a Marvel and X-Men staple. In fact, recently in 2020, we saw a new Giant Size X-Men series emerge in this similar vein, each issue of that series focusing on a story tied to a different X-Men. In the first ever Giant Size X-Men issue number 1, though, a whole new team of X-Men were introduced, featuring Colossus, Wolverine, Storm, Thunderbird, Banshee, Nightcrawler, and Sunfire. Oh, and Cyclops was also there. Although it should be noted, as I talk about the evolution of the roster, I likely won't mention all members every single time to avoid repetition. I'm also not going to mention every single roster because I could just do that in one video and that could be a whole video. Suffice it to say, there have been a lot of X-Men rosters that Scott Summers has been a part of as well. If he's not mentioned, he might still be on there. The difference between this team and the original X-Men team was that this team was a lot more grown up. The former youngsters had all grown up, and this team reflected that, with all new members also being adults as opposed to teens. The Giant Size roster was also unique in that each team member was radically different from the other, having a completely different background, power set, and in many cases even country of origin. This was probably the first roster to really reflect another trait many fans love about the X-Men today: diversity. In terms of the why behind this team, they were brought together to rescue the original X-Men from the deadly sentient mutant island known as Krakoa, currently actually an ally to the X-Men in modern day comics, but once a villain in their history. Technically wedged in between this rescue attempt and when the X-Men ended up in peril was another team initially led by Moira McTaggart, but outside of the canon in real world comic history, this team wouldn't be retconned into existence until the early 2000s. It would serve to help introduce the youngest Summers brother, the quote-unquote mystery Summers bro, Vulcan. But back to the giant-sized team. They were successful in their rescue mission, and afterwards were left to ask the question, now that all the X-Men were safe and sound, new and old, what are we going to do with 13 X-Men? Well, they wouldn't have to worry about this too much, as they weren't lucky number 13 for too long. Shortly afterwards, Sunfire left the team in a huff, Thunderbird died on a mission unfortunately, Iceman and Angel ultimately moved out of the X-Mansion, and Havoc and Polaris decided to go back to school. Jean Grey as well also left for a period, kind of returning to school, but her romantic connection to Scott Summers kept her mostly active on the team's roster. Jean would also eventually become the Phoenix, sending us down a path towards one of the most iconic X-Men stories, I would say, of all time, the Phoenix Saga. And of course the even more iconic follow-up story, the Dark Phoenix Saga. While the adult X-Men team continued on, there were newer mutants introduced, and a second X-Men title was added to make room for them and their stories. This new young team of teen mutants had a book whose title reflected just what they were, the New Mutants, in a way calling back to the simplicity of the title Stan Lee had originally thought up. This era is often considered one of the best among fans, with creative team Chris Claremont and John Byrne often standing out as the main folks we think of when we reflect back on these iconic moments and stories. In addition to the Phoenix Saga, there was also Days of Future Past and God Loves, Man Kills. Many of the stories you've seen brought to life in film and animated series adaptations are actually taken from this time period in mutant and X-Men history. Another spin-off title was added at this time to showcase the tales of the original X-Men roster, the most classic of teams. However, because we already had an X-Men team and title, this book and the team within its pages would become known instead as X-Factor. At that time, X-Factor was the old roster returning to action, not yet a mutant detective agency. Despite being what most fans associate with that name now, that version of X-Factor actually wouldn't become known to us until the early 2000s, with X-Factor Investigations making its first appearance in Madrox issue number 1 in 2004, which led into the 2005 X-Factor series, which is technically volume 3 of that series. Even more books would be added to what seemed to be developing as somewhat of an X-Men line, I would say. Excalibur appeared as part of Marvel UK's collection of comics. This comic featured 3 X-Men, Nightcrawler, Kitty Pryde, and Rachel Summers, who teamed up on adventures with Marvel UK superheroes Brian Braddock's Captain Britain and Megan. By the time we got to the 80s, we had a completely new roster of X-Men who were featured in the Uncanny X-Men title, which actually is considered to be a renamed portion of the X-Men Legacy series. This new roster featured Storm, Wolverine, Colossus, Rogue, Psylocke, Dazzler, Longshot, and Havoc, among others. Angel, Nightcrawler, Polaris, Banshee, and Kitty Pryde's Sprite were also present, as was Professor X. This era featured one of my favorite X-Men story epics, Inferno. While the 80s were a pretty magical time for X-Men stories, the party came crashing to a halt somewhat in issue number 251 of Uncanny X-Men, when the team split up! Of course, no cliffhanger here for us living in the retrospective future, as we know the X-Men would and did return. In issue number 254, a new team revealed themselves, coming together on Muir Island, nearby to Scotland. This roster was made up of both mutants and humans, featuring Banshee, Polaris, Forge, Dr. Moira McTaggart, Professor X's son, Legion, Nightcrawler's magical foster sister and also romantic love interest, Amanda Sefton, Brigadier Sandy Stewart, who belonged to the Weird Happenings organization, aka Who, Tom Corsi, Sharon Friedlander, and very briefly, Sunder. This mutant team is often referred to as the Muir Island X-Men. We were also introduced to supporting characters like the Muir Island Morlocks, including Callisto and Healer, and the Freedom Force, which initially featured Destiny, Mystique, and Valerie Cooper, but would kind of become like an alternate Brotherhood roster, to be honest. The core X-Men team, however, would stay pretty much broken up until issue number 270, when all mutants were brought together once more in Extinction Agenda to fight against the cyborg Cameron Hodge. Possibly one of the most famed X-Men creative teams of all time started to sort out the current state of the X-Men and their fractured rosters as we moved into the 90s. Jim Lee and Chris Claremont. In issue number 273, we got a story called appropriately Too Many Mutants. Truer words were never spoken, which aimed to rectify all the confusion by finally giving us a new X-Men roster featuring Storm, Wolverine, Psylocke, Jubilee, Gambit, Forge, and Banshee. By 1991, we saw the many mutants coming together once more to take on the evil psionic mastermind known as the Shadow King during the Muir Island saga. After that battle, however, we were once more left with the remnants of 3 teams all kind of jumbled together. The Muir Island X-Men, the X-Men X-Men, and X-Factor. Once again, at the end of X-Factor issue number 70, we were left with the question, this time asked by Professor X, what am I going to do with 14 X-Men? No one looks pleased either about this issue on the page where this question is asked, perhaps because they are all upset that Professor X has maybe forgotten them, as he seems to have miscounted, but I assume this is just supposed to be a play on the 13 and we're just one-upping it, because there's definitely people that are not included in that count, including some who are not pictured here, and you know, Professor X himself. There were likely even more than 14 X-Men now gathered. The solution to this question finally came in the form of creating multiple actual X-Men teams. Not spin-offs, but instead 2 main rosters. This is where the much-loved original X-Men Gold and Blue rosters come in, and this love is in fact proven by sales, with Jim Lee and Chris Claremont's X-Men issue number 1 being known as the best-selling comic of all time. At the time of this recording, there have been a reported over 8 million copies sold, which is pretty wild. The blue team featured Cyclops as leader, with Gambit, Rogue, Beast, Psylocke, Wolverine, and Jubilee rounding out the team's ranks, and briefly featuring Revanche as well. The blue team featured more of the edgy and newer X-Men characters, and was written and drawn by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee. Featured in the pages of the second volume of X-Men from 1991, starting of course with issue number 1, although they wouldn't actually be the blue team until like a few issues later, in terms of like them just being the mainstay. Think about issue 4. The gold team, on the other hand, featured Storm as leader, with members including Colossus, Angels, Archangel, Bishop, Jean, Forge, and Iceman. This team was depicted as the more seasoned and experienced one, showcasing more of the classic X-Men of the 60s and 70s. This team's stories were told in the pages of Uncanny X-Men, kicking off with issue number 281 of the series. I personally love this cover. The creative team involved included John Byrne, Jim Lee, and Wilchi Portacio. The costumes showcased with both teams, designed by Jim Lee, became pretty iconic and served to inspire their looks in the 90s X-Men animated series. To this day, they're still my favorite X-Men suits. The 90s was also the time that we were introduced to the mutant Black Ops team X-Force, who initially started out as kinda like time-traveling assassins made up of the former New Mutants team, who are now being led by big gun-toting, time-traveling son of Madeline Pryor, Scott Summers, and sort of Jean Grey from the future, Cable. X-Factor would also continue as a government-funded team led by Havoc and Polaris, and despite the fact that the 2 mainstay teams were introduced to help simplify the murkiness created by having simply too many characters, the 90s is actually where it gets somehow even more confusing. Despite each team being somewhat tied to a specific X-Men title, these titles both had X-Men in the name, and often stories unfolded and were woven through multiple series, meaning you needed to collect multiple titles to get the whole story. While this can be fun at the time of collecting, it can also be exhausting, and expensive, and confusing to figure out when you're returning back to older stories. Both teams actually lived in the X-Mansion, but simply went on separate missions. Starting in 1993 with Uncanny X-Men issue 298 and X-Men issue number 17, the teams also started to swap members for certain missions, making everything even more confusing for readers to try to discern between the 2 once very distinct rosters. During this era, however, we did get many memorable and character-defining stories, including Fatal Attractions, Phalanx Covenant, and the Onslaught event. But by 1994, the terms blue and gold had kinda lost all meaning, with both teams pretty much melding together. By 1998, the roster had shrunk down to 8 core members, including Wolverine, Storm, Nightcrawler, Colossus, Kitty Pryde, Rogue, Gambit, and Marrow, surprisingly, with stories featuring the team continuing to weave back and forth between Uncanny X-Men and the X-Men series, starting with issue number 360 and issue number 80, respectively. respectively. Since the 90s, there have been a slew of other important stories as we moved into the 2000s and beyond, including the alternate timeline Ultimate X-Men, E is for Extinction, House of M and M-Day, Messiah Complex and Messiah War, Schism, Avengers vs. X-Men, Inhumans vs. X-Men, and Resurrection. There have also been countless X-Men books featuring multiple teams, many of which simply refer to themselves as the X-Men, even when a mainstay X-Men book was also already ongoing alongside them, which means we get a lot of stories, but also making sense of the X-Men roster gets more and more confusing. These titles have included The Amazing X-Men, The Astonishing X-Men, Extreme X-Men, New X-Men, which was the mainstay at the time known as the Grant Morrison era of X-Men, X-Men Legacy, Young X-Men, Wolverine in the X-Men, which is actually one of my favorites, All New X-Men, which featured the time-displaced OG X-Men, X-Men Gold, Spider-Man in the X-Men, Extraordinary X-Men, the 2017 relaunch of Blue and Gold teams with X-Men Blue and X-Men Gold. And then of course there were all the books that were simply known as Uncanny X-Men and X-Men, including one volume of the series simply titled X-Men from 2015 that features an all-female roster of mutants led by Storm that I feel like no one really ever talks about for some reason. I still can't believe how seemingly quiet the hype surrounding that series was, and I know that not a lot of people were super here for it, but also, what a cool team! I suppose it all pretty much goes to show you that by the 2010s, people were pretty much overwhelmed with X-Men content, with the mutant hype receding for some time. To give you some more perspective here, despite the initial X-Men series being consistently returned to, sometimes renamed, but often maintaining or returning to actual legacy numbering, we are still also on the 6th volume of the X-Men title with the 2021 series. Pretty crazy to think, considering how long some of those other series went on for. The modern age, however, has seen a great boost to X-Men popularity, and I have to say I feel lucky to be one of the folks reading along through this entire era. In 2019, Jonathan Hickman and Pepe Larraz became the main creative team behind House of X and Powers of 10, which kicked off the era of X-Men we are in now, which I like to refer to as the Krakoan era. This has been a 3-part multi-year saga that is still ongoing, spanning a number of series in the double digits. The 3 major acts of this epic can be divided between Dawn of X, Reign of X, and Fall of X. Events have included one of my all-time favorites, Ten of Swords, the Marvel-wide crossover AXE Judgment Day or Axe, and SOS, aka Sins of Sinister, as well as recurring yearly Hellfire galas, which we can all dress up and attend in our minds. However, the X-Men history and family will continue on as the Krakoa era is soon coming to a close, with 2023's Hellfire Gala being advertised as the last. Kang the Conqueror is often considered to be the prime Kang, while other versions of the character are either Kang from alternate timelines or perhaps divergent versions of the character who split off through time to follow another path and become known by a completely different name, which sounds like an alternate version but it's kind of a little different. I'll touch somewhat on these alternates while trying to keep us mostly focused on the main Kang, Kang the Conqueror. Often known for being an Avengers and Fantastic Four villain, Kang the Conqueror is a villain from the future, who often manipulates the timeline in order to bring his plots to fruition. Himself, being a genius, he is also the kind of villain that can sometimes act as an ally to heroes when a threat is too great for them to handle it alone. Oh, and he's also a man of many chairs. He has a time chair that he literally uses to time travel, and he also has this sweet, floating, invisible beanbag chair because he's from the future. I hope in the future we all get invisible beanbag chairs, and guess what? We do, because this video is brought to you by Float, the new invisible beanbag chair. No, I'm just kidding. I wish though. If you invent an invisible beanbag chair, please sponsor us, because I want one of those. Kang the Conqueror is kind of a weird villain with a very unique look, which I think is why so many are surprised to see him coming to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and were surprised when he was revealed to be, you know, kind of a villain that we'd be seeing. Initially, I was one of the people that also thought this was an unusual pick for a villain, especially with him appearing as the seeming main antagonist in the Ant-Man and the Wasp film Quantumania. But then I thought thought about it, and I realized just how serious of a threat Kang could be if he weren't reduced to simply being one iteration of the character. Kang is not just a universal threat like Thanos was after all, he is a potential multiversal threat. Fighting Kang is like fighting a one-man time-traveling army that is always multiple steps ahead of you, and also an army that seems to fight within itself and only creates more problems by doing that. And also a villain where anyone, even your closest allies, could secretly be manipulated by, or perhaps even just straight up be, a Kang variant. Now, as soon as I realized that the multiverse was what we were building towards in the next phase, Kang's presence made a lot more sense to me. Multiverse of Madness, What If, Loki, and even to a certain extent I would say WandaVision all seem to be pushing towards this idea of expanding the MCU beyond just the home universe. I mean, even Ms. Marvel kind of gets in on that idea with her being able to access another dimension, or at least, we kind of allude to that, we see that a little bit in that series. With Shang-Chi and the Ten Rings, I thought we might be going cosmic when we kind of got that tease where we're talking about where are the rings from, and now I think we're likely going beyond that to other dimensions. I wouldn't be surprised if the Ten Rings were like, I don't know, based in quantum something or doing some other universal stuff that came from another world entirely. Kang the Conqueror first appeared as a foe to the Avengers in issue number 8 of their first series. He was created by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, and boy is he a true Jack Kirby creation if ever I have seen one. He's a lot of a lot, and also, I mean, that character design. Super Jack Kirby in the best of ways. Well, Kang was seemingly instantly defeated by having a radiation attack bounced back at him, forcing him to flee on his spaceship despite having somewhat of a natural immunity to radiation thanks to being from the future. This wouldn't nearly be the last we'd see of him, and I would say he almost instantly made his mark as an iconic character in that issue. Man, in the future, what do we have to look forward to? Invisible beanbag chairs and apparently some level of radiation immunity. Sounds pretty cool to me if that's our future. Kang the Conqueror is said to hail from the 30th century, believed to be the future or a version of the future of Earth 616. Kang's home reality, however, is known as Earth 6311, sometimes also referred to as Other Earth. Other Earth is a little bit different from the main reality in that there were no dark ages on this world, so that's also why we don't just call it, the future of 616, and honestly, even if we did, we'd probably still give it another number because we never want to be too specific in the comics with what the future really holds. Instead, this alternate Earth skipped the era known as the Dark Ages. Thanks to rapid advancement, they would end up with a colony on the moon, known as Luna, but unfortunately would succumb to war when both the Earth and the moon colony clashed with one another. As a result, the moon would be destroyed entirely, completely obliterated, and its pieces would rain down on Earth, causing massive destruction and leaving the people of planet Earth largely scattered and isolated. Other Earth would also be a world that Reed Richards' father, Nathaniel Richards of Earth 616, would travel to, unite together, and ultimately lead alongside his wife, Cassandra, who hailed herself from Earth 6311, helping Other Earth to recover from a devastating war. Cassandra herself, I believe, is a princess in that future, so, that happens and then you can rule together. However, Cassandra would eventually come to covet the power she held and become known as the villain Warlord, unbeknownst to her husband. But eventually the Fantastic Four would travel to Other Earth and help to defeat Warlord. Years later, Cassandra and Nathaniel's children would rule, truly ushering in an era of peace. It was during this time that Nathaniel Richards was born. No, not Reed Richards' father, Nathaniel. His possible future descendant, Nathaniel Richards. Are you confused yet? Although some signs actually point to this Nathaniel, who would become Kang, as a true descendant of Victor Von Doom instead, aka Dr. Doom, the Fantastic Four villain. And others still seem to reconcile both of these records, implying that Nathaniel Richards of Earth 6311 was actually a descendant from both Reed and Victor, somehow. When I say that, I always imagine like a ship of Reed and Victor together and they're like in love, and then somehow Nathaniel's descended from that, but that's not exactly what we mean here, I don't think. When Nathaniel was just a teenager, one of his first other personas entered the chat. This was the person many of us got excited about as potentially existing in the MCU. Iron Lad. Iron Lad is a member of the Young Avengers, acting as the team's version of Iron Man. When Iron Man ends up getting help from a kid named Harley Keener in Iron Man 3, many people believed this could actually be a version of Iron Lad and we could see Iron Lad in the MCU. And now, with Kang being introduced into the MCU in Quantumania, many believe we could yet see a more comic book adaptation of Iron Lad via Jonathan Majors. Perhaps another alternate version of Kang, where instead Kang Kang becomes the hero known as Iron Lad. This current theory comes from the comics, where Iron Lad, member of the Young Avengers, is later revealed to be a teenage version of Nathaniel Richards of Earth 6311, aka a past version of Kang, before he obviously became Kang. Iron Lad comes to Earth 616 to hide, and hopefully seek help from the Avengers to protect him from his future self, refusing to grow up and become Kang. He's basically looking for a way to avoid that. In fact, Kang the Conqueror would even end up having a comic series with his younger self, Iron Lad, in 2021, titled Kang the Conqueror. Now this 5-issue mini would be all about Kang basically trying to teach his younger self and young Nathaniel wrestling with his own fate and destiny. Kang was basically trying to get him to accept him becoming Kang and teach him how to be the best Kang he can be. This wouldn't be the only version of young Kang that we'd come to know though. In addition to Iron Lad, there is also Kid Immortus, I believe in comic book history, who came into existence following Nathaniel's time as Iron Lad. While Iron Lad made his first appearance in the mid-noughts in Young Avengers issue number 1, Kid Immortus made his first appearance back in 2013 in FF issue number 8, the second FF volume. Not to be confused with the second Fantastic Four volume, which is a different title. So when I'm saying FF, I literally mean the letters FF. And I know that's confusing because FF is often used as a short form when we're talking about the Fantastic Four. But this time around, well, it is also being used in that context in terms of, what the book is about. It's also literally just FF if you're looking to follow up on that series and you're trying to Google it. Even when we aren't directly talking about time travel stuff in Kang's history, it can be confusing to follow. So hopefully you're following along with me here. Let me get my chart. Are you following along all this weirdness? Despite these adventures through time and the attempts young Nathaniel made to avoid ever becoming Kang, he would end up doing just that, becoming Kang. This part of the story, however, hasn't really been documented yet and is a bit of a gap in his history. What we do know is that Kang and other versions of him across time do exist, implying that even after his time as Kid Immortus and Iron Lad, Nathaniel Richards returned to his own timeline and eventually would decide to time travel, although it's unclear if his memories of being either of these younger personas remains with him or not. Eventually, Nathaniel would turn to time travel as a way to apparently alleviate boredom, coming to the ancient past and settling down in Egypt, where he would be known by another name, Rama Tut. Nathaniel would indeed become Pharaoh Rama Tut, living as a ruler in Egypt until the time-traveling Fantastic Four showed up and stopped him. Because, that's what they do. Following this, Rama Tut attempted to return back to his own timeline from there, but he got caught in a time storm along the way, as I guess is warrant to happen when you are time traveling. Admittedly, I don't recall hearing of many other time storms in the history of Marvel Comics, but they must happen, and maybe they're just a little bit more rare. We only hear of them every now and then. I think Wolverine did end up in a time storm once with Puck when they traveled kind of through a picture back to a war-torn 1930s Spain, but other than Kang, I think that's about all I can think of. Let me know in the comments all the time storms you can think of. Oh wait, I actually think my insult of time storms has caused one to head our way. Oh no, hurry, click the like button to save me from being displaced through time. Help! Whew, okay, thanks to those of you who clicked like, that was a close one. And to all of you who did not click like, I want you to know that my life flashed before my eyes. Caught in the time storm, Rama Tut ended up displaced in modern day Earth 616. There he met his possible ancestor, Dr. Doom, and was inspired to give up his Rama Tut persona to become more like Doom. Which honestly, fair enough. If I met Dr. Doom, I'd also probably be like, you seem cool, I'm gonna do what you're doing. This was how Nathaniel would go on to become Scarlet Centurion. It was also later revealed that the time storm he was caught in was actually all done by Immortus, yet another time-divergent version of Kang. Apparently, Immortus created time storms to prevent Kang from creating certain alternate reality selves and to stop him from, I guess, tampering too much with the timeline. Often in comics, Kang's most dangerous enemy tends to be another version of Kang, and Immortus and Kang have definitely both acted against one another throughout their histories. Scarlet Centurion didn't quite work out for Kang as an identity. He ended up encountering the Avengers in the Avengers 1968 annual, and this would be similar to how his first ever comics appearance would go, in the sense that he would end up being pretty handily defeated here. This prompted him to abandon the Scarlet Centurion look and name and return once more to being Rama Tut, which, after all, I suppose, had been much more successful in comparison, so that makes sense to me. As Rama Tut, Nathaniel would once more attempt to return home to the future of the 30th century, but alas, more time storms. Rama Tut goes to check the weather. Dang time storms, time storms, time storms, jeez! All weather channels are forecasting time storms all this week. How am I supposed to travel through time in this terrible weather? This is awful. Also, this weatherman, Immortus, he sure looks familiar to me. Oh well, whoever he is, he certainly is a handsome devil, I'll say that. Once more being tossed up in another time storm, Rama Tut instead missed his stop in the 30th century, instead being catapulted even further into the future, into the 40th century. There, he discovered primitive beings fighting with sort of past technological weapons they no longer seem to fully understand. At this point, Rama Tut fancied himself a sort of a master of past tech and weapons and figured, screw it, I could just rule these people. I have the knowledge to do it, so why wouldn't I? And so Nathaniel reinvented himself once more as Kang the Conqueror. Finally, we're there! He succeeded in conquering this far-flung future, not just the planet, but beyond, building his own galactic empire. However, Kang still found himself thinking back to the past and the modern era of Earth 616. Not fully satisfied with what he had accomplished here in the future, he set out to become the ruler of Earth 616 as well. It's also believed that his ambition to rule the time period of Earth 616 was also tied to the fact that he'd heard a tale of a celestial Madonna, who would become the mother of the most powerful man in all of known history. Basically, Kang wanted to become the baby daddy of that most powerful figure, which is kind of a weird thought when, like me, you know that the celestial Madonna turned out to be the hero Mantis, and that her baby would grow up to be the half-human, half-Kotati Sequoia, aka Koya, who recently was one of the main villains of the Empire event a few years back. I wonder if there's a future where instead of the Kotati resurrected version of Swordsman being that baby's dad, Kang is his dad instead? I would read that what if it does not yet exist. Who is Mr. Sinister? Mr. Sinister was originally known as Nathaniel Essex. He is one of the greatest mutant geneticists the world over. Over the years, he has perfected the cloning process, created chimeras, sparked new life, altered his own DNA to make himself mutant, manipulated others' powers, increasing, decreasing, or better focusing them, and has augmented victims with his own DNA, altering them forever by kind of bonding them to himself. Before we travel back in time to the beginning of Mr. Sinister's weird and wacky story and origin, let's talk about his comic book origins in regards to his first chronological appearance. Mr. Sinister was first mentioned following the devastating attack on the Morlocks, often referred to in the comics as the Mutant Massacre. Following the attack in issue 212 of Uncanny X-Men, we get the first mention of him. Wolverine is hot on the trail of those responsible attempting to hunt them down when he runs into Sabretooth, because of course Sabretooth is involved in this dastardly plot. Startled by Sabretooth's appearance in the sewers, but not at all shocked, Wolverine exclaims, "You're part of this?" Sabretooth responds, "Yep," adding, "Mr. Sinister's dealing a game that don't allow for wild cards like the Morlocks, or you X-chumps either. So he sent the Marauders to resolve the situation, cause we're the very best there is at what we do, like you used to be." This was the first mention of Mr. Sinister, who would make his first visual appearance almost 10 issues later in issue 221 of the series. Sporting pointed teeth and a scowl that to gaze upon would likely leave you paralyzed with fear, Mr. Sinister's ghostly white nightmarish face appears on the very first page of this issue. He lets out a growl expressing his disappointment in how the team have failed to eliminate one of his creations, Madeline Pryor, who he wanted destroyed and disposed of to cover up his own connection to her. "You failed me, Marauders, and failure is something Mr. Sinister does not tolerate." I'm here for it. I'm here for the creepy stuff. Mr. Sinister is one of my favorites. Mr. Sinister's connection to both the Morlocks and Madeline Pryor run even deeper than you can imagine though, and extend all the way back to Victorian England, and the character's origins as he transformed from Nathaniel Essex, esteemed scientist, to something much more, well, sinister. As a child, Nathaniel Essex loved watching the busy flow of traffic. He enjoyed studying the patterns of people's movement and predicting which way people would go, observing that they always seemed to follow preordained paths. This would be the beginning of Essex's obsession with predictions. In the limited team-up series further adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix, we learn more about Essex's origins. I also just love the art in this series. It's kind of a cool series to revisit. I like that I get to do this video so I can revisit it. Here we learned that as a man, Mr. Sinister was actually a respected scientist who married Rebecca Milbury, back when he was of course Nathaniel Essex. Tragically, their young son passed away as the result of multiple birth defects. Struggling with grief, Nathaniel coped by burying himself in his work, struggling to accept the passing of his son. Essex became obsessed with Darwin's theory of evolution. He believed too many scientists were limited by their morals when it came to ideas and experiments. Why do we have morals? Ugh, what a waste of time! I don't have time for these morals. Essex predicted the existence of mutants, believing they would emerge as a result of natural evolution. He predicted that humanity would evolve rapidly thanks to what he referred to as Essex factors. You know you're a scientist when you're naming things after yourself. As a result of this far-out theory and questionable experiments, he was disgraced and kicked out of the Royal Society, though really due to his questionable experiments, which were pretty Frankensteinish, to be honest. Around this time, Essex would ally with his first ever team of marauders. Not these marauders. These marauders! And have them collect all sorts of deformed ne'er-do-wells from the streets of London to become his unwilling test subjects in mad science experiments. While working for Essex, the Marauders woke up the powerful mutant known as Apocalypse, who had been in hibernation. Apocalypse asked to meet the leader of the Marauders and was taken to him, posing as a man intrigued by Essex's theories on evolution. During their interaction, Essex learned that his predictions had been correct, as En Sabinur was Apocalypse, a mutant. The duo ran into a time-traveling Cyclops and Phoenix, who were sent back in time by the Ascani. While Nathaniel is tempted to join Apocalypse here, he ultimately instead decides to passionately commit himself to his family and his wife running home, because Rebecca does not like how obsessed he has become of late with his work. Unfortunately, upon returning home, he learns that his wife, Rebecca, has learned of his secret, very creepy experiments and his prisoners, and has freed them all. As a result of the stress of this revelation, she also went into early labor and is now basically on the brink of death. While on her deathbed, she refuses to forgive Nathaniel, labeling him as utterly and contemptibly sinister. Whew, fair. Rebecca's speaking some truths as she dies. Mourning the death of his wife and loss of his family, he ultimately returns to Apocalypse, deciding to become his ally in the end. I mean, I guess what else are you gonna do? Apocalypse is a mutant who perfectly represents Essex's hypothesis regarding mutants and evolution. Apocalypse is his theory in essence come to life. Apocalypse painfully genetically mutates Essex using celestial technology, making him his first prelate, which is also, you know, just how Apocalypse do. With Nathaniel taking for himself the name his wife gave to him on her deathbed. Sinister. Sinister allowed Apocalypse to remove his humanity from him, leaving him with no moral code to speak of going forward. However, in his fight against Cyclops and Phoenix, he found himself pretty fascinated by them. Believing Apocalypse, his new master, to be cruel, without purpose, and therefore insane, Sinister decided to reject him, betraying him by unleashing a deadly plague that Apocalypse had him make, but only releasing it on his master, thereby forcing Apocalypse to return to hibernation. Sinister would go on to say that cruelty without purpose was ignorance, and that ignorance was the greatest enemy of science. But if you're cruel and you have a purpose, then you're just apparently a great scientist to Mr. Sinister. Phoenix and Cyclops returned to the future, and while their mission to seemingly stop Apocalypse was successful, it would turn out that the true plan Clan Ascani had for them was to inspire Sinister to set into motion plans that would one day lead to the birth of Nathan Summers, aka Nathan Dayspring, aka Cable. So yeah, that's how closely tied Mr. Sinister is to the Summers family. His obsession surrounding the Summers and the Greys in the future would actually come from his interaction with their future selves who had journeyed into the past. Wild, right? I hope you're following me with this timey-wimey stuff. In the 1999 Gambit comic series, we learned Sinister had moved from England to America. Sinister's appearance in Gambit series also makes sense given their history, where Sinister was shown to be a regretful ally, later enemy, who Gambit becomes indebted to. Although that wouldn't happen until the future. The future past? The future. Confusing. Time travel again. But we'll talk about that part later anyways. While in the Americas, Sinister would adopt the name of Dr. Nathan Milbury, taking his wife's surname. He would run the Essex Clinic as an obstetrician. There he would also continue to conduct morally devoid experiments and would even continue to study the genetics of Daniel Summers, one of his prisoners and test subjects back in England who had escaped. Or at least Daniel had thought he escaped Essex. Apparently he didn't, unfortunately. Sinister would also experiment on Amanda Mueller and made deals with her to acquire several of her babies after they were born for his own purposes. Amanda Mueller would go on to become one of the founders of Weapon X, an evil woman tied to the Summers family tree known as Black Womb, and Daniel Summers also tied. For more on Amanda Mueller and Daniel, you can check out our part 2 video for attempting to explain the Summers family tree. Despite Gambit not actually being alive at the time, in terms of he wasn't really born yet because it's the past, Sinister would first meet him in 1891. This was possible because Gambit and a shapeshifting mutant named Courier had traveled back in time. Upon meeting Sinister, the two made their first deal. Sinister agreed to free Thieves Guild members and give Gambit information in exchange for a sample of Courier's genome. Sinister would blend Courier's genes and abilities with his own and end up teaming up temporarily with Gambit. However, the Thieves Guild members involved would have their memories wiped and therefore would not remember these events. So, in case you're wondering why they don't remember, that's why. At this point, Sinister was not yet Mr. Sinister, to be clear, but was known simply as just Sinister. The name change might not seem like a big difference, but in regards to the character and his identity, it actually is. Mr. Sinister had a completely different personality in comparison, being more feral in nature. This personality actually developed after Sinister returned to his old home, the Milbury house, in 1895, to conduct more experiments. It was then that he learned he was dying and developed the Mr. Sinister persona. He had a kind of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing going on in regards to this split, struggling with episodes as he continued to deteriorate. Essex would run into Mystique and Destiny, who found him as part of their own investigation. They had him taken to Bedlam, where he died overnight. However, this wouldn't be the end for Sinister, as we learn in Immortal X-Men issue number 8. Mystique and Destiny would learn that prior to his death, Sinister had cloned himself 4 times, with the goal of surviving in clone forms to the 20th century and beyond. Each one of his clones was marked by a symbol belonging to a different card deck suit. The Diamond clone is still known as Mr. Sinister and is a mutant. The clone of Clubs we know is Dr. Stasis, who appears to be human. The other remain unknown at the time of this recording, though I imagine the Sins of Sinister event will shed some more light on their stories, and we might actually know more if there's something that I missed or didn't read, which, if that's true, let me know in the comments because I'd love to read it.
Issue 1 begins with a quote by Carl Jung that sets the tone for the story. Man is on the whole less good than he imagines himself or wants to be. At a gas station, a teenage girl is shopping for a drink while a drifter looks at a newspaper that talks about how the Hulk is assumed dead. An armed robber comes in and tries to rob the cashier, but is spooked when the girl drops a glass bottle in shock at the sight of him. He instinctively turns and shoots the girl. The drifter is shocked at this and starts to get angry. Before we can find out if the robber will like him when he's angry, he shoots the drifter in the head, seemingly killing him. The cashier begs for his life, but not wanting to leave any witnesses, the robber kills him too. We are then introduced to a reporter named Jackie McGee. She is clearly a riff on the investigative reporter Jack McGee, who was hunting the Hulk in the classic 1970s Incredible Hulk television series. Jackie is covering the robbery for the local paper and is informed by the local police captain that they are not optimistic about finding the murderer. Meanwhile, in the morgue across town, night falls and the drifter comes back to life, transforming into the Hulk. Hulk goes after the distraught robber, who we learn was only stealing to try and pay off a debt to a local biker gang so he can support his family. Hulk attacks the gang and chases the robber, who he soon corners. Hulk, who by the way is extremely articulate in this series, asks if the gun made him feel powerful, and if he secretly wanted to shoot those people to feel that power unleashed. The robber begs for mercy, saying that it was a mistake. I'm not a bad guy, am I? Hulk closes in on him, retorting, "What do you think?" The next day, Jackie is talking to the police in the hospital. The entire gang has been severely injured, and the robber may never wake up, and has almost broken every bone in his body. The police reveal to Jackie that the gang members are claiming that it was the work of the Hulk, and that Bruce Banner must not be dead. In a nearby motel room, Bruce sits contemplating his own morality, asking his reflection if he is a bad person. Issue 2 begins with Bruce having a nightmare about the hours after his exposure to the gamma bomb when he was believed to be in the walking ghost phase. The walking ghost phase is a real term used to describe the hours after exposure to severe radiation where the body has yet to show symptoms of the horrible death that is to come. Bruce remembers the terror of feeling fine, but hearing the clicking of the Geiger counter telling him that this was not the case. The frustration of this triggered a Hulk out. As Bruce wakes up, we learn about what his life has become. He is on the run, owning nothing, not even the clothes on his back, which he always loses when the Hulk comes out. He survives by begging or stealing what he can during the day, but remarks that the night belongs to the Hulk. This is a throwback to the very first Hulk comics, where rather than being triggered by rage, Banner's Hulkouts were triggered by the rising and falling sun. This was the cause of the transformations until Incredible Hulk number 4, when Bruce began triggering the transformations with the use of a machine. It wasn't until about a year later in Tales to Astonish number 60 when the Hulkouts began to be triggered by emotional outbursts. Bruce has found that the Hulk is able to guide him to situations where he is needed with an almost psychic accuracy, and has been spending his time trying to do good to atone for his past sins. This brings him to a small town where several people are dying one after each other. This chain of grief started with the death of the town's star quarterback, whose father was a doctor specializing in radiation treatment. Bruce visits the graveyard and realizes that the quarterback's grave is giving off gamma radiation, and that the string of deaths is a result of people visiting the grave, getting radiation poisoning, dying, and then infecting their loved ones when their graves are visited. Bruce tries to call in an anonymous tip to the government, but in order to be believed, has to reveal his identity to the operator. He climbs a mountain and finds a glowing green cave, where he discovers the radiation doctor, Dr. Fry, who has been transformed into a glowing green ghost-like gamma creature. A walking ghost, if you will. He is surrounded by the dead bodies of people who discovered the cave that he has been killing in order to avoid them knowing he is alive. He attacks Bruce, but Hulk comes out. Fry admits to the Hulk that after his wife died, he started fearing death, and in order to avoid it, created his own gamma formula inspired by Banner's work. It seemed to work with no side effects, so when his son announced that he was going away to play football at college, Fry gave him the formula to help him avoid injury on the field. Unfortunately, it turned out that the reason Fry hadn't had any adverse effects was because he had developed a minor tolerance to gamma radiation due to his constant exposure to it through his work. His son got sick fast, bleeding green out of his eyes and throwing up green bile worthy of Danny DeVito's Penguin. The son started talking about how he could see a green door below them and that someone was looking through it. He died, and soon after, Fry began transforming into a gamma creature. Hulk explains the consequences that his actions have had on the town, and Fry begs for his life as he is still afraid of death. Hulk tears off his limbs and buries him in the cave, sealing off the entrance, leaving him to spend eternity buried alive and alone. The issue ends with Fry reconsidering his position and screaming and begging for a death that will not come. Something I can relate to as someone who saw X-Men Dark Phoenix in theaters. Issue 3. Jackie McGee is interviewing people who witnessed an incident involving the Hulk and the villain Hotshot. Each witness is giving a very different perspective on the events, with each of their stories being drawn in a different art style. Hotshot had taken a church hostage because he believed that his girlfriend Jess had been possessed, and he wanted to get her an exorcism. Like Dr. Fry's son, she had been rambling about a green door that she had been seeing in visions. Hulk busts in and stops Hotshot, and Jess is found dead in a motel with her head spun the wrong way around. The words "green door" have been scrawled on the wall. Hotshot is blamed for her death and hangs himself in prison soon after. Jackie puts the story together, but gets a phone call from Walter Lenkowski, aka Sasquatch of Alpha Flight. He also wants to find Bruce as he needs help with an issue he is having with his Sasquatch side. Issue 4. Walter arrives in South Dakota to talk to McGee. He explains his origin to her. Although a Canadian, he was attending Penn State University on a football scholarship, where he was rooming with a young Bruce Banner who had transferred to Penn for a semester to use their gamma facilities. Although most considered Walter a jock, he also had a passion for science and was inspired by his roommate to start learning about Gamma and became his research assistant. Bruce would sometimes go off on Walter, resenting the fact that he was already beloved as a football player and was trying to also become a Gamma scientist, something Bruce considered his territory. Walter went on to be a football star until he saw on the news what Bruce had become. He made it his mission to replicate Banner's work in a more controlled fashion, and using his NFL fortune and help and funding from the Canadian government's superhero monitoring agency, Department H, conducted an experiment quite similar to the one that transformed Banner into the Hulk in both the 70s TV show and the 2008 MCU film. The goal was to create a creature that could act as a deterrent for the Hulk, but as the experiment was conducted in the Arctic Circle, where the walls of reality are thinner, Walter became Sasquatch and saw the Green Door. A demon known as Tanarak entered him and started causing trouble, but that issue was dealt with all the way back in Alpha Flight Volume 1, Issue 23, and Walter insists that he has been demon-free ever since. Now that I've gone on my traditional tangent about Alpha Flight, let's get back to the Hulk. Walter's story causes Jackie to remember an incident when she was a child, where the Hulk went on a rampage in her hometown when she was a child and she saw him, developing a lifelong obsession with the Jade Giant. She and Walter begin tailing Bruce, stopping at bars where he has been spotted to try and find out where he is going. At one of these bars, a fight breaks out, and while trying to break it up, Walter is stabbed in the back. He is forced to experience every Canadian's worst nightmare while traveling in the States and is taken to the hospital for a no doubt very expensive surgery. While sitting in the waiting room, Jackie wonders why Walter didn't transform into Sasquatch when he was stabbed. Bruce shows up and talks to Jackie, telling her that they need to evacuate the hospital. In the operating room, Walter transforms into Sasquatch and begins attacking the surgeons. Issue 5. Issue 5 begins with a flashback aboard the Alpha Flight space station. Although originally Canada's greatest super team, Marvel has changed this so that they have become an international task force operating in space, being led by Carol Danvers, aka Captain Marvel. Now, I am not a fan of this. I mean, no disrespect to Captain Marvel, but why the f isn't an American in charge of Alpha Flight? It's our one cool super team. Ugh. Anyways, stay on topic, Andrew. This isn't an Alpha Flight video, it's a video about the Hulk. Anyways, in this flashback, Carol Danvers tells Sasquatch that the team is concerned that he is getting more aggressive in the field. Longtime team member Puck points out that it is becoming increasingly rare that Walter is seen in his human form. Walter brushes off their concerns, but when in private, discovers that it is becoming more and more difficult for him to return to his human form. In the present at the hospital, Banner gets McGee to evacuate the hospital while he goes to confront Sasquatch, who has eaten his entire surgical team. Bruce asks Walter if they can talk, but Sasquatch says, "I'm not Walter," and attacks Bruce, triggering his transformation into the Hulk. They fight, and Hulk deduces that Walter stayed in his Sasquatch form too long, and as a result, something got into him through the Green Door. The demon controlling Sasquatch reveals that he is actually the spirit of Bruce's evil dead father, Brian Banner. Now, Brian is a piece of work who is responsible for a lot of the trauma in Bruce's life and the death of his mother. He has fought Bruce multiple times over the years and is one of the few people that Bruce and the Hulk fear. This causes the Hulk to struggle in the fight before he realizes that it is Bruce who has a reason to fear Brian, not him. Brian reveals that he is being used as a host personality for some other being known as the One Below All. He uses Walter's claws to blind Hulk. Brian corners McGee, but Hulk absorbs the gamma in Walter's body, causing him to transform back into his human form. Hulk allows McGee to ask him one question. She asks how to become like him, and Hulk tells her to go home and leaves. Walter wakes up and realizes he no longer has the power to transform into Sasquatch. Hulk realizes that when he absorbed Walter's gamma, he also absorbed Brian Banner into him. Issue 6. Bruce is in a motel. He only has hazy memories of what happened at the hospital, but knows that Hulk has absorbed something from Walter, and therefore hasn't let the Hulk out in 2 days. Hulk writes a note to Banner telling him they must return home. In California, Bruce's wife, Betty Ross, watches reports about the Hulk on the news and reasons that it can't be him as if Bruce was alive, he surely would have reached out. We discover that her and the Hulk's other allies are being watched by an organization known as the Shadow Base. They have found Dr. Fry and are trying to use him to create a creature that can battle the Hulk. In order to find the Hulk, they decide to use the recent incident with Sasquatch to their advantage. On Alpha Flight Space Station, Walter is being examined by longtime teammate Shaman, who suspects that the force that took him over was creation's other dark half, the one below all. Captain Marvel comes in and reveals that the US government is wanting to extradite Walter and have him put to death for his involvement in the hospital incident. The only way to prevent this is to capture the Hulk and hand him over to the government with the help of a super team that it actually makes sense for her to be a member of, the Avengers. In Iowa, Bruce is making his way home to the Gamma test site where the Hulk was born. Hulk believes that the extra power of the site will give him the strength to defeat Brian. Danvers shows up with the Avengers and tries to take him into custody, but he transforms into the Hulk and prepares to take on his former teammates. Issue 7. Hulk fights the Avengers, managing to take out Thor, Captain America, Black Panther, Iron Man, and She-Hulk, while Captain Marvel works to evacuate a nearby town. Iron Man is weirdly eager to try out a weapon known as the Helios laser. They fire it and it reduces the whole town to ash and turns Bruce into crispy bits. He is turned over to the Shadow Base, who split him into separate pieces and keep the various body parts in jars to prevent Hulk from healing while they study him. The scientists at the Shadow Base are studying Hulk's healing factor as they continue to torture the vivisected hero. On Alpha Flight Space Station, Danvers tells McGee about how the Hulk has been taken by the US government without a trace, as anyone who could give them information has become unreachable. Although he no longer has his powers, Walter is still an expert in gamma radiation and is put in charge of a new team by Captain Marvel with the mission of locating the Hulk. They call themselves Gamma Flight as a bit of an inside joke, although there actually was already a Marvel team known as Gamma Flight. You see, back when Alpha Flight operated under the Canadian government, they had various training teams that heroes would join while they worked their way up to the main team, one of which was Gamma Flight. Ugh. Focus, Andrew, it's not an Alpha Flight video. Hulk, you're talking Hulk! In the lab, Hulk reveals that he has been allowing the scientists to study him so that he can better understand himself, and could have escaped at any time. He snaps his fingers, creating a shockwave that shatters the jars, allowing his various body parts to reassemble. He absorbs the cruel scientist who has been torturing him, and escapes to make his way to the Gamma Bomb site. Issue 9. The villain Bushwhacker is working for the Shadow Base and is tracking the Hulk as he continues on his journey. The Shadow Base has made a deal with Carl Creel, aka the Absorbing Man, and have been experimenting on him to make him stronger so that he can defeat the Hulk. The experiments give him the ability to absorb gamma power and turns his skin red. Hulk gets to the base but realizes that it was actually Brian Banner's idea to go there so that he could get rid of the Hulk. Hulk is about to leave when he is attacked by Absorbing Man. They fight, but Hulk grows weaker and emaciated every time he lands a blow. Creel absorbs too much of Hulk's power and ends up absorbing Brian Banner and the One Below All. Absorbing Man's consciousness is transported to another realm where the One Below All appears before him in a form Creel can comprehend, and tells him that as a creature of pride, he was always going to end up in hell. Back on Earth, Creel's body tears itself apart in front of a shocked Hulk. Issue 10. Aboard Alpha Flight Space Station, Walter gets a positive ID on Hulk's gamma signature and sets out with Gamma Flight and McGee to track him down. Creel is still stuck in the other realm and cries about how sorry he is. Back on Earth, his mutilated body repeats the words to an unimpressed Hulk, but continues to attack him. Hulk rips out Absorbing Man's spine and uses it to beat the crap out of him. Jackie, Puck, and Walter show up in a ship to try and speak to Hulk, but Bushwhacker uses a sniper rifle to take a shot at Hulk, making Hulk think that Gamma Flight is firing on him. He is sent into a blind rage, and with a thunderous Hulk smash, takes out the ship. Hulk comes to his senses when he sees Creel running towards the test site. He realizes that Brian's plan was to absorb more gamma radiation so he could open the green door. Before he can go after Creel, Puck shoots him with a plasma rifle. Creel absorbs the gamma radiation and opens the green door, transporting Hulk, Jackie, Puck, Walter, and Bushwhacker into the other realm. Jackie asks where they are, and the Hulk turns to her and says, Welcome to Hell.
Tony Stark is the son of Howard Stark and Maria Stark. Howard owned Stark Industries and actually helped his father, Howard Sr., to build the company. From a young age, like Tony, Howard was known for having a brilliant mind, excelling in engineering. He would grow up and end up working with S.H.I.E.L.D., joining them on many missions and aiding their efforts. As a wealthy man, he would also gain access to the Hellfire Club, but was more a member because he enjoyed their parties apparently, as opposed to being aware or aligned with any of their political beliefs and more sinister pursuits. Eventually, Howard would meet Maria at one of his casinos in Monaco. He would return a lost earring to her and help her escape her own bodyguards, who didn't seem to actually have had Maria's own best interests in mind. Not as much is known about Maria's life before she met Howard. What we do know is that she was a socialite and a philanthropist who was born into wealth in Southampton, New York. When Stark first met her at his casino, she was in an unhappy relationship with Obadiah Stane. She went to the casino with the intention of losing copious amounts of money, and this is basically what got her roughly escorted out by her own bodyguards, whom she and Howard would later defeat and of course escape. Maria and Howard would fall in love and later be married, going on to become the only parents that Tony would initially ever know. But Howard and Maria Stark weren't the only parents that Tony would actually have, or at least would later learn that he'd ever had. Tony, it turned out, was adopted. Learning this later in life, it would be revealed that a Hydra agent and S.H.I.E.L.D. agent were actually his two biological parents, one of them being Jude. Jude was a Hydra agent who went undercover at S.H.I.E.L.D. Really though, he apparently had no allegiances, believing both agencies to be problematic in similar ways. Jude was more interested in serving his own interests and profiting off of playing both sides. Jude would meet Tony's birth mother, Amanda Armstrong, a singer who was also working as an undercover agent for S.H.I.E.L.D. while on a mission. The two fell in love and began a relationship, with Jude often traveling to faraway places throughout the course of their few years together. Amanda became pregnant, and shortly before she was due to give birth to their child, Amanda's life was threatened, and then Jude's life was threatened, and Amanda learned of Jude's true beliefs surrounding Hydra and S.H.I.E.L.D. He suggested that they run away together, but unwilling to accept Hydra's money or their protection, Amanda attacked Jude and then ran away. She gave their baby up for adoption, and that was how Tony became a Stark, adopted by Maria and Howard. In fact, the name that the Starks gave to their baby, Anthony, would actually come from Amanda herself, the name that she actually wished her son to have. Amanda had asked Nick Fury to make sure that the baby ended up in a nice and safe home, but Nick basically disregarded her wishes, following the standard S.H.I.E.L.D. protocols instead, which had the baby end up in an orphanage. Howard heard of Amanda and the child and ended up choosing to find and adopt the baby, with him and Maria keeping the name Amanda had picked originally. Years later, when Tony learned the truth of his parentage, he would seek out his biological parents and meet Amanda. After falling into a coma, Jude would also resurface in Tony's life, attempting to capture his son. Despite the fact that Jude had died years earlier in his fight against Amanda, or seemingly died, Jude in fact had been alive most of the time, having been resurrected and returned to life by Hydra and remaining in their employ all these years. But while Tony was the only known child of Amanda and Jude's, he was not the only son of Howard and Maria Stark. In fact, before they adopted Tony, they actually already had a son. Maria and Howard, after being wed, struggled to conceive a child together, and when they finally succeeded, it appeared the life of the unborn was threatened. As a result, they searched high and low for any possible way to ensure that the baby was healthy and that the birth was a success. When Howard learned of an alien being, a Rigelian recorder known as Recorder 451, he brought together the Stark Seven in an effort to free the being. After succeeding in rescuing the recorder from its captors, Howard and Maria discussed a way that the recorder might be able to repay them. 451 revealed its plans to help advance the human race so that they would be protected against alien threats in the future, and eventually usher in an era of universal peace. Recorder 451 noted that their unborn child was actually the perfect specimen for this effort, and Howard and Maria were reassured by this when they learned it would also ensure their son's survival. However, Howard would later learn that in modifying the baby to make it more resilient, 451 had also added in kind of like a kill switch. Nervous about this, Howard secretly concocted a bio cocktail to alter the modifications, with the purpose of removing said kill switch from the mix. After the birth of their son, whom they named Arno, 451 left Earth, but Howard's tampering with the modifications done to his son ended up resulting in young Arno becoming fatally ill shortly after being born. Fearful of 451's possible vengeance, Howard hid what he'd done in order to protect Arno. Howard and Maria hid Arno away in the Maria Stark Foundation, keeping his existence a secret. They then adopted Tony around the same time and raised him to believe he was actually their natural born son in order to prevent 451 from getting suspicious should the being ever return to Earth. Howard did record a message for Tony to explain Arno's existence and the truth of his own birth and biological parentage. However, after the deaths of Howard and Maria, the log remained buried for many years before Tony eventually did learn the truth. Arno was initially the lost brother that Tony had never known, that he perhaps secretly wanted. Also a genius, as he was modified by 451 to be as such, after Tony learned of Arno's existence, the two would often team up and work together, combining their brilliant minds. Arno would become an ally of Tony's for a time, while Tony hadn't known of Arno's existence until later in his life. From the safety of his hospital bed and iron lung, Arno had actually been monitoring and watching Tony's progress as he grew up. However, while the two were initially friendly and brotherly towards one another, eventually they would be at odds with one another, with Arno becoming delusional and somewhat villainous even. Bruce Banner would trick Arno into helping him in a fight against Tony during Original Sin, and later Arno would choose to betray his brother, allying himself with rival company Banetronics in secret. Tony was made to believe that his body, completely engineered at this point, was more akin to AI and robots than humans, giving Arno the ability to delegitimize Tony as a human being, taking away his rights, his property, and his resources. Arno would become Iron Man, believing that the AI threat known as the Extinction Entity was on the rise. Tony would ally himself with the AI and their right to free will, because, at that point he felt he was more alike to them, and then the two brothers would clash. Eventually, it would be revealed that the Extinction Entity was not real, but merely the result of a delusion on Arno's part. While Arno at this point had believed he had healed himself fully of his fatal disease and effectively removed any flaws from his genetic code, the truth was he was actually still on the verge of dying, as 451 had initially programmed to happen to Arno in his prime. Seeing this, Tony trapped his brother inside his own armor and put him into a stasis. The suit acted as a life support system, while Arno's mind was submerged in a virtual dream, where he believed he had defeated the Extinction Entity and was celebrated as a hero. As Tony grew, he would develop a close and loving relationship with his mother Maria, while struggling to establish a strong connection to his father Howard. This was actually due to the fact that Howard and Tony had very different temperaments, and the fact that Howard turned more and more to drink, making him much more abrasive and causing him to often mistreat Tony. Howard also liked to meddle in Tony's love life and affairs, preventing him from pursuing many of his romantic interests growing up. However, it was later believed that this was done out of a sort of strange kindness, with Howard seeing it as protecting his son. While Tony would think his father was never really proud of him, those close to Howard felt kinda just the opposite, that Howard actually really loved and respected his son and therefore tried to do everything in his power to protect him. Howard and Maria would later perish in a car accident on the Ides of March, but it was later believed that this was no true accident, but a successful assassination attempt on their life. However, it's also been suggested that their deaths were faked and that they could even still be alive today, with Howard confessing prior to his supposed death that the Shield of the Brotherhood had plans to use a car accident to fake their deaths. Following the death of his parents, Tony would inherit and run Stark Industries, create a charity in his mother's name, and would eventually go on to become the hero we know as Iron Man. Iron Man in part was also an identity that was inspired by Howard in a weird way. Howard always had a phrase he'd repeat to Tony that Stark men were made of iron. When Howard was cruel towards Tony, he escaped in tales of fantasy, growing up with the stories of King Arthur and the armor-adorned knights of his round table. Tony fantasized about creating a man made of iron. But while Howard and Maria profoundly impacted Tony and his upbringing, there was another super influential figure who acted as a caretaker for him. Edwin Jarvis, the family butler, and possibly someone who has influenced Tony's life even more than his parents, as Edwin outlived them and continued to serve Mr. Stark following their deaths. Kind of a similar relationship to Batman and Alfred, really. Jarvis became the butler for the Stark family after serving in the British military during World War II, and despite him having a British accent, he may not actually be British by birth, but instead an American who traveled to Britain at a young age to serve in the war and then developed his accent there. Although in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, he does seem to be pretty OG British to me, so I think he's just straight British over there. Edwin Jarvis was influential in Stark's life from a young age. When Tony was young, he had a pet dog named Leo who passed away. Tony was emotional and heartbroken over this loss, being only a boy at the time and honestly, understandably upset. Howard berated him though for his displays of emotion. Jarvis, however, did not, and instead encouraged Tony to express his grief through other means. Tony would use his emotions as fuel, inspiring him to create brilliant inventions. Jarvis has sometimes been relieved of his duties as a butler butler, forced to resign as a result of injury or of issues with the Avengers, but has always eventually returned to service. Fun facts, he's been brainwashed into becoming an ally of Ultron, posing as villain the Crimson Cowl, and at one point was implied to have a relationship with Spider-Man's Aunt May during her stay at the Avengers Mansion. Iron Man's family tree does not end there. While never married, Iron Man has had many romantic relationships throughout the years, though honestly, too many paramours for me to list here. That is best saved for its own attempting to explain the widespread dating life and history of Tony Stark. Tony also has an extended family, including his uncle, Howard Stark's brother, Edward, and his cousin, Edward's son, Morgan. And he also has a grandfather that we've known of, Howard's own father, Howard Sr. Isaac Stark Sr. has also been mentioned as an ancestor of Tony's. Happy Hogan, Pepper Potts, and Rhodey are also all close allies to Tony, who I would consider to be like family to him. While Tony doesn't have any natural born kids in the main reality of Earth 616, you could say that the progenitor who appears during the AXE Judgment Day event is kinda like his offspring, as Tony helped to create the man-made Celestial using his own nervous system as a blueprint in the Celestial's construction. During the King in Black event, Tony also found himself bonded to a symbiote known as the Extrembiote. And finally, there is some weird timey-wimey stuff in his family tree. During the Marvel event The Crossing, Tony was revealed to be a sleeper agent for Lord Immortus, aka a version of Kang the Conqueror. In order to defeat him, the Avengers got help from a younger version of Tony who would later become time displaced and actually take over for the original after he died. This would later be reconciled, however, when the younger Tony was combined with the former older Tony Stark, blending the two together to make them one entity, the true Tony Stark. So yeah, that's also a weird part of his history. Arno also created AI robot versions of Howard and Maria Stark known as Arsenal and Mistress. They ended up agreeing to be uploaded to the virtual dream that Tony put Arno's consciousness in order to prevent Arno from realizing that this was a virtual reality and not real life. I'm sure that will never backfire. Oh boy, that's gonna backfire at some point. Where are Spider-Man's parents? While Spider-Man was raised by his aunt and uncle from a young age, his actual parents were Richard and Mary Parker. Richard grew up in New York City and Queens and was actually the much younger brother of Ben Parker, who would of course become a guiding light for Peter as he started out as a young hero, with Ben's loss instilling in Peter the famous motto, "Great power comes great responsibility." Richard was a secret agent working for the CIA, who in fact was brought into the fold by none other than the original Nick Fury. Mary herself was also a secret agent working for the CIA, and both her and Richard often went on missions together, working side by side. They were killed after being found out when they were working as double agents, attempting to infiltrate an Algerian spy ring. The finisher was the one who ultimately did the deed, but was ordered to do so by Red Skull after the Red Skull learned of their true allegiances. Spider-Man's secret sister? Well, Uncle Ben and Aunt May have each played major roles in Peter's life. Before we move on to them, I want to talk about his potential secret sister, Teresa Parker. Oh yeah, Spider-Man has a secret sister. Or does he? Teresa Parker, as we'd come to know her through the comics, was at time believed to be the daughter of Richard and Mary Parker, who they actually had in secret. Because of her birth being kept a secret, she was therefore not raised alongside her brother Peter under the care of Uncle Ben and Aunt May, but instead, she was adopted. Years later, like her father, she too would be recruited into the CIA by Nick Fury. To put it mildly, her origin is confusing. Even for Teresa, she struggled to find the real truth of her parentage. While there are clues that have led her to believe she herself is a Parker, it's possible that she was simply manipulated into thinking this by external villainous forces. It's also possible that her parents were simply shapeshifters impersonating Richard and Mary, and there's actually stuff in Teresa's life that has led us to believe that, which has also been, suggested and implied in the comics, so that could be a possibility. However, regardless of her true origin, after her adventures with Spider-Man, Teresa decided to reject all other alternative origins that were offered and instead see herself as a Parker, regardless of whether or not she was actually the birth daughter of Richard and Mary. So even if she isn't actually blood related to Peter, she isn't actually the true sister of him, to Teresa, she'll always see herself as his sister. Uncle Ben and Aunt May's origins. Benjamin Parker was the much younger brother of Richard Parker. When he was younger, he fell for one of the prettiest women around, May Riley. However, at the time, having spent most of her life struggling financially, she was attracted to another man who she believed could give her a life of comfort and adventure during a time when economically many were actually actually struggling. However, Ben came to help May realize the truth about her suitor at the time, Johnny Jerome, who was actually a criminal. After realizing the truth about Johnny and grieving the loss of her first love, May actually began to fall for Ben, and really, the rest is kinda history. Although the couple's life together wouldn't always be easy, and they would still have their own arguments, even almost breaking up multiple times, ultimately their life together was still one filled mostly with happiness and with a lot of love. They were married and did attempt to start having a family, but health complications prevented them from doing so. While his brother Richard and his sister-in-law Mary were killed in the line of duty working for the CIA as undercover agents, Ben and May had been looking after Peter, and actually ended up adopting him after they learned what had happened to the young couple. 3 become 2. While Aunt May would eventually become Peter's rock in his life, initially she was reluctant in her role as his parental figure and basically his adoptive mother. Ben, however, was quick to warm up to Peter and easily transitioned into the role of a father figure for the young boy. And while May thought back to her own childhood and how her parents had blamed her birth for the trouble between them, she would also eventually warm up to Peter. Instead of Peter driving a wedge between Ben and May, adopting him and taking him in actually had the opposite effect for them, strengthening their bond and their love for one another. Tragically, Ben would be ripped from both May and Peter shortly after the young Parker first manifested his spider-like powers. It was actually Ben's loss that gave Peter more motivation to act as a superhero, teaching him that with great power comes great responsibility. With the loss of Ben, May would once again be forced to struggle financially, prompting Peter to get a job at the Daily Bugle as a photographer to help support his aunt. However, this also caused May to worry about her young nephew, as she initially did not know that he was also secretly the superhero Spider-Man, although of course she would come to know that. Who are Peter's grandparents? Did you know that Peter is actually the second of his name? Technically, we should call him Peter Parker II. His grandfather on his dad's side was also a Peter. He and his wife Anne had their names recorded in a copy of the Daily Bugle in 1939, where the birth of their firstborn son, Ben, was announced. Peter and Anne Parker would of course become parents to not just Peter's famous Uncle Ben, but also his father, Richard Parker, as the two are brothers. We don't know much about Mary's parents either, Peter's maternal grandparents. However, we do know that Mary was mainly raised by her father, William Fitzpatrick, whose wife tragically died quite young. Her name is, as of yet, still unknown to us. The former wife of Spider-Man. Did you know that Peter Parker was actually married? There's a whole bunch of stuff there. It's true. As time progressed in the comics, Peter would grow up, going through high school and college, and eventually settling down with his love, Mary Jane Watson. Prior to this, one of Peter's greatest loves was actually Gwen Stacy, and even after marrying Mary Jane, Peter still often thought of Gwen, who died young at the hands of his foe, Green Goblin. Although as Spider-Man, Peter had actually tried to save Gwen, he ultimately failed to do so, and some actually even consider her death his fault, as the tension of his web is believed to have actually caused Gwen's neck to snap. Although Green Goblin has claimed before that the sheer shock of the fall for Gwen would have basically killed her, and that she was already dead by the time his web would have reached her. Why am I mentioning all this in a part of the video where I'm meant to be talking about Peter's wife? Well, because there are alternate worlds and realities where Peter does actually end up with Gwen. In the House of M reality, the two of them settled down together and even had a son, and I think part of Peter always wonders what his life would have been like had Gwen lived. However, Mary Jane was also friends with Gwen and also felt her loss. I also feel like Gwen's death actually brought her and Peter closer together. Peter and MJ's relationship was never really easy, with MJ at first not being very interested in the idea of a committed relationship, and wanting more to focus on her career as a performer and a model, as well as simply just having fun. However, after a few attempted proposals, MJ eventually did say yes, and the two were married for quite some time, even almost successfully starting a family together. And just as there are alternate realities where Gwen and Peter are together, there are many alternate realities where MJ and Peter are as well, and where they also have kids together, including the alternate worlds of MC2 and Renew Your Vows. However, in the main continuity, their marriage would not last, after Mary Jane and Peter ultimately decided to sacrifice their relationship to Mephisto in order to save Aunt May's life, after she was shot in a hit that had been intended for Peter during Back in Black. The children of Spider-Man. While in the multiverse, Spider-Man actually has many children. In the main continuity, he hasn't really ended up with any, at least not currently and not as far as we know right now. He was almost a dad when he and his wife Mary Jane were pregnant with a daughter. Unfortunately, the young soon-to-be parents were later made to believe, following delivery, that their daughter had actually been lost to them. Venom. In reality, we learned that the child had lived, but had actually been swept away as part of Norman Osborn, Green Goblin's own Sinister plans. Despite the hope, however, that one day this child might return to her parents, honestly, I'm still a little hopeful of that, it would later be established that their daughter May had been disposed of later on at the order of Norman Osborn. In the MC2 reality, however, Peter and MJ's daughter does exist and was raised by both of her parents. She would grow up and develop her own spider-like abilities and powers, becoming known at first as the hero Spider-Girl, before adopting the mantle of Spider-Woman. This version of the character is also named May Parker, after Peter's beloved Aunt May, and is often referred to by her nickname of Mayday. Norman Osborn at one point also manipulated twins, Gabriel and Sarah Stacy, to believe that they were in fact the children of Spider-Man and Gwen, while also making them believe that Spider-Man was actually responsible for their mother's death. These children, however, were actually at first revealed to be the children not of Peter and Gwen, but of Norman and Gwen. I know. Fortunately, we'd later learn that this was also not true, and that they were actually clones created by Harry Osborn to torment his father Norman, having Norman's mind manipulated so that he would believe he had slept with Gwen, when in reality, he actually hadn't. Thank goodness. Thank you for fixing that, because it broke my brain. In the main continuity, there is also Master Matrix, who sees Deadpool and Spider-Man actually as his dads, funnily enough. Master Matrix is a life model decoy initially reassembled by Peter's parents, Richard and Mary Parker. After being activated, this LMD would come to see Deadpool and Spider-Man as his parents, and would also work alongside them as an ally. More recently, Matrix appeared in the Amazing Mary Jane series, where he befriended MJ after joining a film crew and also helped to defeat the Savage Six.